Vorkuta. True, this railroad was under construction for a long time. Its Vim sector, from Knyash-Pogos to Ropcha, was ready for service in 1938, but the whole railroad was ready only at the end of 1942. And thus, from the depths of the tundra and the taiga, rose hundreds of new medium-sized and small islands, and on the march, in battle order, a new system of organization of the archipelago was created. Camp administrations, camp divisions, camps, OLPs, separate camps, KOLPs, commandants' camps, GOLPs, head camps, camp sectors, and these were the same as work parties and work sub-parties. And in the administrations there were departments, and in the divisions there were sections. 1. Production, P. 2. Records and Classification, URCH. 3. Security Operations, again the third. And in contemporary dissertations they wrote, the contours of educational institutions for individual undisciplined members of the classless society are taking shape ahead of time. In actual fact, when there are no more classes, there will be no more criminals. But somehow it takes your breath away just to think that tomorrow's society will be classless. And does that mean that no one will be imprisoned? Only individual, undisciplined members? Classless society is not without its lockups either. And so all the northern portion of the archipelago sprang from Solovki, but not from there alone. In response to the Great Appeal, corrective labor camps, ITLs, and corrective labor colonies, ITKs, burst out in a rash throughout our whole great country. Every province acquired its own ITLs and ITKs. Millions of miles of barbed wire ran on and on, the strands crisscrossing one another and interweaving, their barbs twinkling gaily along railroads, highways, and around the outskirts of cities. And the peaked roofs of ugly camp watchtowers became the most dependable landmarks in our landscape, and it was only by a surprising concatenation of circumstances that they were not seen in either the canvases of our artists or in scenes in our films. As had been happening from the Civil War on, monastery buildings were intensively mobilized for camp needs, were ideally adapted for isolation by their very locations. The Boris and Gleb monastery in Torzhok was put to use as a transit camp, still there today, while the Valdai monastery was put to use for a colony of juveniles across the lake from the future country house of Zhdanov. Nilova Hermitage on Stolpny Island in Lake Seliga became a camp. Sarovskaya Hermitage was used for the nest of Potmar camps, and there is no end to this enumeration. Camps arose in the Donbass, in the upper, middle, and lower Volga, in the central and southern Urals, in Transcaucasia, in central Kazakhstan, in Central Asia, in Siberia, and in the Far East. It is officially reported that in 1932 the area devoted to agricultural corrective labor colonies in the Russian Republic alone was 625,000 acres, and in the Ukrainian Republic 138,000. Estimating the average colony at 2,500 acres, we learn that at this time, without counting the other Soviet republics, there were already more than 300 such sekolzi alone, in other words, the lowest grade and most privileged form of camp. The distribution of prisoners between near and distant camps was easily determined by a decree of the Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars of November the 6th, 1929. How they do manage to hit the anniversary dates of the revolution. The former strict isolation, detention, was abolished because it hindered creative labor, and it was ordained that those sentenced to terms of less than 3 years would be assigned to the general, near, places of imprisonment, while those sentenced to from 3 to 10 years would be sent to distant localities. Since the 58th never got less than 3 years, that meant that they all flocked to the north and to Siberia, to open it up and to die. And the rest of us during those years were marching to the beat of drums. A stubborn legend persists in the archipelago to the effect that the camps were thought up by Frenkel. It seems to me that this fanciful idea both unpatriotic and even insulting to the authorities, is quite sufficiently refuted by the preceding chapters. Even with the meagre means at our disposal, we succeeded, I hope, in showing the birth of camps for repression and labor back in 1918. Without any Frenkel whatsoever, they arrived at the conclusion that prisoners must not waste their time in moral contemplation. The purpose of Soviet corrective labor policy is not at all individual correction in its traditional meaning, but must labor, and at the same time must be given very severe, almost unbearable work norms to achieve. Long before Frenkel, they already used to say, correction through labor, and as far back as Eichmann's, they had already understood this to mean destruction through labor. Yes, and not even contemporary dialectical thought processes were needed to arrive at the idea of using prisoners sentenced to heavy labor for work in remote, little settled areas. Back in 1890, in the Ministry of Railroads, they decided to use hard labor exiles in the Amur region for laying rails on the railroad. They simply forced the hard labor prisoners to work, while exiles and deportees were permitted to work at laying rails, and in return got a reduction in their terms by 1/3 or 1/2. However, they preferred to get rid of their whole term all at once by escape. And from 1896 to 1900, work on the Lake Baikal shoreline sector of the Trans-Siberian was carried out by 1,500 hard labor prisoners and 2,500 compulsorily resettled exiles. However, generally speaking, the course of development in 19th century Russian hard labor was in just the reverse direction. Labor became ever less obligatory, withered away. By the 90s, even at Kari, hard labor camps had been transformed into places of passive detention, and work was no longer performed. By this time, too, the demands made on workers had been eased at Akatui, P. Yakubovich. So the use of hard labor prisoners on the Lake Baikal shoreline sector of the railroad was most likely a temporary necessity. Do we not observe here once again the two-horn principle, or that of a parabola, just as in the case of the long-term prisons, Part 1, Chapter 9, one prong of increasing leniency and one of increasing ferocity? Therefore, the idea was by no means new and not founded on progressive educational theories. Nonetheless, Frenkel really did become the nerve of the archipelago. He was one of those successful men of action whom history hungrily awaits and summons to itself. It would seem that there had been camps even before Frenkel, but they had not taken on that final and unified form which savors of perfection. Every genuine prophet arrives when he is most acutely needed. Frenkel arrived in the archipelago just at the beginning of the metastases. Naftali Aronovich Frenkel, a Turkish Jew, was born in Constantinople. He graduated from the Commercial Institute there and took up the timber trade. He founded a firm in Mariupol and soon became a millionaire, the timber king of the Black Sea. He had his own steamers, and he even published his own newspaper in Mariupol called the Kopek, whose function was to slander and persecute his competitors. During World War I, Frenkel conducted some speculative arms deals through Gallipoli. In 1916, sensing the pending storm in Russia, he transferred his capital to Turkey even before the February Revolution, and in 1917 he himself went to Constantinople in pursuit of it. And he could have gone on living the sweetly exciting life of a merchant, and he would have known no bitter grief, and would not have turned into a legend. But some fateful force beckoned him to the Red Power. I have a personal hypothesis about this, which I will mention elsewhere. The rumor is unverified that in those years in Constantinople he became the resident Soviet intelligence agent, perhaps for ideological reasons, for it is otherwise difficult to see why he needed it. But it is a fact that in the NEP years he came to the USSR, and here, on secret instructions from the GPU, created, as if in his own name, a black market for the purchase of valuables and gold in return for Soviet paper rubles. This was a predecessor of the gold drive of the GPU and Torgsin. Business operators and manipulators remembered him very well indeed from the old days. They trusted him, and the gold flowed into the coffers of the GPU. The purchasing operation came to an end, and in gratitude, the GPU arrested him. Every wise man has enough of the simpleton in him. However, inexhaustible and holding no grudges, Frenkel, while still in the Lubyanka or on the way to Solovki, sent some sort of declaration to the top. Finding himself in a trap, he evidently decided to make a business analysis of this life, too. He was brought to Solovki in 1927, but was immediately separated from the prisoner transport, settled into a stone booth outside the bounds of the monastery itself, provided with an orderly to look after him, and permitted free movement about the island. We have already recalled that he became the chief of the economic section, the privilege of a free man, and expressed his famous thesis about using up the prisoner in the first 3 months. In 1928 he was already in Chem. There he created a profitable auxiliary enterprise. He brought to Chem the leather which had been accumulated by the monks for decades and had been lying uselessly in the monastery warehouses. He recruited furriers and shoemakers from among the prisoners, and supplied fashionable, high-quality footwear and leather goods directly to a special shop on Kuznetsky Most in Moscow. The GPU ran it and took the receipts, but the ladies who bought their shoes there didn't know that, and when they themselves were hauled off to the archipelago not long after, they never even remembered the shop. One day in 1929, an airplane flew from Moscow to get Frenkel and brought him to an appointment with Stalin. The best friend of prisoners and the best friend of the Chekists talked interestedly with Frenkel for 3 hours. The stenographic report of this conversation will never become public. There simply was none. But it is clear that Frenkel unfolded before the father of the peoples dazzling prospects for constructing socialism through the use of prisoner labor. Much of the geography of the archipelago being described in the aftermath by my obedient pen, he sketched in bold strokes on the map of the Soviet Union to the accompaniment of the puffing of his interlocutor's pipe. It was Frenkel in person, apparently on that precise occasion, who proposed the all-embracing system of classification of camp prisoners into groups A, B, C, D, which left no leeway to the camp chiefs and even less to the prisoner. Everyone not engaged in providing essential services for the camp, B, not verified as being ill, C, and not undergoing correction in a punishment cell, D, must drag his workload, A, every day of his sentence. The world history of hard labor has never known such universality. It was Frenkel in person and in this very conversation who proposed renouncing the reactionary system of equality in feeding prisoners, and who outlined a unified system of redistribution of the meager food supplies for the whole archipelago, a scale for bread rations and a scale for hot food rations, which was adapted by him from the Eskimos, a fish on a pole held out in front of the running dog team. In addition, he proposed time-off sentence and release ahead of term as rewards for good work. But in this respect he was hardly original, for in 1890 in Sakhalin hard labor, Chekhov discovered both the one and the other. In all probability, the first experimental field was set up here too, the great Belomostroy, the White Sea-Baltic Canal construction project, to which the enterprising foreign exchange and gold speculator would soon be appointed, not as chief of construction, nor as chief of a camp either, but to the post especially dreamed up for him of works chief, the chief overseer of the labor battle. It is evident from his face how he brimmed with a vicious, human-hating animus. In the book on the Belomor Canal, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, wishing to laud Frenkel, one Soviet writer would soon describe him thus: the eyes of an interrogator and a prosecutor, the lips of a skeptic and a satirist, a man with enormous love of power and pride, for whom the main thing is unlimited power. If it is necessary for him to be feared, then let him be feared. He spoke harshly to the engineers, attempting to humiliate them. This last phrase seems to us a keystone to both the character and biography of Frenkel. By the start of the Belomostroy, Frenkel had been freed, For construction of the Belomor Canal, he received the Order of Lenin and was named Chief of Construction of Bamlag, the Baikal-Amur main line railroad, which was a name out of the future. While in the 30s, Bamlag was put to work adding a second track to the Trans-Siberian main line on those sectors where there was none. And this was by no means the last item in the career of Naftali Frenkel, but it is more relevant to complete the account in the next chapter. The whole long history of the archipelago, about which it has fallen to me to write this homegrown, homemade book, has, in the course of half a century, found in the Soviet Union almost no expression whatever in the printed word. In this, a role was played by that same unfortunate happenstance by which camp watchtowers never got into scenes in films, nor into landscapes painted by our artists. But this was not true of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, nor of the Moscow-Volga Canal. There is a book about each at our disposal, and we can write this chapter at least on the basis of documentary and responsible source material. In diligently researched studies, before making use of a particular source, it is considered proper to characterize it. We shall do so. Here before us lies the volume, in format almost equal to the Holy Gospels, with the portrait of the demigod engraved in bas-relief on the cardboard covers. The book, entitled The White Sea-Baltic Stalin Canal, was issued by the State Publishing House in 1934 and dedicated by the authors to the 17th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, and it was evidently published for the Congress. It is an extension of the Gorky project of Histories of Factories and Plants. Its editors were Maxim Gorky, I.L. Averbach, and S.G. Firin. This last name is little known in literary circles, and we shall explain why. Semyon Firin, notwithstanding his youth, was deputy chief of Gulag. Anguished by the vanity of authorship, he also wrote his own individual booklet about the Belomor Canal. The history of this book is as follows. On August the 17th, 1933, an outing of 120 writers took place aboard a steamer on the just-completed canal. D.P. Vitkovsky, a prisoner who was a construction superintendent on the canal, witnessed the way these people in white suits crowded on the deck during the steamer's passage through the locks, summoned prisoners from the area of the locks, where by this time they were more operational workers than construction workers, and in the presence of the canal chiefs asked a prisoner whether he loved his canal and his work, and did he think that he had managed to reform here, and did the chiefs take enough interest in the welfare of the prisoners. There were many questions, all in this general vein, and all asked from shipboard to shore in the presence of the chiefs, and only while the steamer was passing through the locks. And after this outing, 84 of these writers somehow or other managed nonetheless to worm their way out of participating in Gorky's collective work, though perhaps they wrote their own admiring verses and essays, and the remaining 36 constituted an author's collective. By virtue of intensive work in the fall and winter of 1933, they created this unique book. This book is continued on Cassette 3, Side 1. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 3, Side 1. There were many questions, all in this general vein, and all asked from shipboard to shore in the presence of the chiefs, and only while the steamer was passing through the locks. And after this outing, 84 of these writers somehow or other managed nonetheless to worm their way out of participating in Gorky's collective work, though perhaps they wrote their own admiring verses and essays, and the remaining 36 constituted an author's collective. By virtue of intensive work in the fall and winter of 1933, they created this unique book. This book was published to last for all eternity, so that future generations would read it and be astounded. But by a fateful coincidence, most of the leaders depicted in its photographs and glorified in its text were exposed as enemies of the people within 2 or 3 years. Naturally, all copies of the book were thereupon removed from libraries and destroyed. Private owners also destroyed it in 1937, not wishing to earn themselves a term for owning it. and that is why very few copies have remained intact to the present, and there is no hope that it may be reissued, and therefore all the heavier is the obligation to my fellow countrymen I feel on my shoulders not to permit the principal ideas and facts described in this book to perish. It would be only just, too, to preserve the names of the authors for the history of literature. Well, these at least: M. Gorky, Viktor Shklovsky, Vsevolod Ivanov, Vera Inber, Valentin Katayev, Mikhail Zoshenko, Lapin and Katsrevin, El Nikulin, Korneli Zelinsky, Bruno Yasensky, the chapter Beat the Class Enemy to Death, Y. Gavrilovich, A. Tikhonov, Alexei Tolstoy, K. Finn. Gorky explained in the following way why this book was necessary to the prisoners who had built the canal. The Canal army men do not have the necessary vocabulary to express the complex feelings of reforging, and writers do have this vocabulary, so they will help. It was decided to call them this in order to raise morale, or perhaps in honor of the labor army which was never created. He explained as follows why the book was necessary for the writers. Many writers, after becoming acquainted with the canal, got charged up as a result, and this has had a very positive impact on their work. A mood is going to appear in literature which will push it ahead and put it on the level of our great deeds. And why the book was necessary to its millions of readers, many of them were soon to flow to the archipelago themselves, requires no elaboration. What was the point of view of the author's collective on the subject? First of all, certainty as to the justice of all sentences and the guilt of all those driven to work on the canal. Even the word certainty is too weak. For the authors, this question is out of bounds, not only for discussion, but even for mention. It is as clear to them as the fact that night is darker than day. Using their vocabulary and their imagery to instill in us all the misanthropic legend of the 30s, they interpret the word wrecker as the basis of the engineer's being. Agronomists who spoke out against early sowing, maybe in snow and mud, and irrigation experts who provided Central Asia with water, all were indubitable wreckers to them. In every chapter of the book, these writers speak only with condescension of engineers as a class, as of a foul, low breed. On page 125, the book accuses a significant segment of the Russian pre-revolutionary engineering profession of swindling. And this is not an individual accusation, not at all. Are we to understand that engineers were even engaged in wrecking Tsarism? And this was written by people of whom not one was capable of extracting even the simplest square root, which even certain horses do in circuses. The authors repeat to us all the nightmare rumors of those years as historical gospel truth, that workers were poisoned with arsenic in factory dining rooms, that it is not just a piece of stupid carelessness if milk from the cow on a state farm went sour, but an enemy's stratagem to compel the country to swell up from starvation. And that's exactly how they write. In indefinite and faceless terms, they write about that sinister collective kulak who went to work in a factory and threw a bolt into the lathe. Well, after all, they are oracles of the human heart, and it is evidently easier for them to imagine this. A person has managed by some miracle to avoid exile to the tundra, has escaped to the city, and by some still greater miracle has managed to get work in a factory when he is already dying of hunger, and at this point, instead of feeding his family, he throws a bolt into the lathe. Then, on the other side, the authors cannot and do not wish to restrain their admiration for the leaders of the canal works, those employers whom they stubbornly call Czechists, although it is already the 30s, thereby forcing us to use the name too. They admire not only their minds, their wills, their organization, but also them, in the highest human sense, as surprising beings. Indicative was the episode with Yakov Rapoport. This student at Dorpat University, who failed to complete the course there, was evacuated to Voronezh, where he became the deputy chairman of the provincial Cheka in his new homeland, and then deputy chief of construction at Belomoystroy. In the words of the authors, Rappaport, while on an inspection tour of the construction site, was dissatisfied with the way the workers were pushing their wheelbarrows along, and he posed an annihilating question to the engineer in charge. "Do you remember what the cosine of 45 degrees is equal to?" And the engineer was crushed and put to shame by Rappaport's erudition, and immediately made corrections in his instructions aimed at wrecking, and the movement of the wheelbarrow is immediately moved onto a high technological level. And Rappaport got the meaning of the cosine all wrong. And with such anecdotes as these, the authors not only enrich their exposition artistically, but also lift us onto scientific heights. And the higher the post occupied by the employer, the greater the worship with which he is described by the authors. Unrestrained praises are lavished on the chief of Gulag, Matvei Berman. Much enthusiastic praise is also lavished on Lazar Kogan, a former anarchist who in 1918 went over to the side of the victorious Bolsheviks, and who proved his loyalty in the post of chief of the special branch of the Ninth Army, then as deputy chief of the armies of the Ogpu, and was one of the organizers of Gulag, and then became chief of construction of the Belomor Canal. And it is even more the case that the authors can only endorse Comrade Kogan's words about the Iron Commissar. "Comrade Yagoda is our chief, our constant leader." This is what more than anything doomed this book. The glorification of Genrikh Yagoda was torn out, together with his portrait, from even that one copy of the book which survived for us, and we had to search a long time in order to find this portrait of him. This same tone permeated the camp leaflets even more strongly. Here, for example, "The honored guests, comrades Kaganovich, Yagoda, and Berman, arrived at lock number 3. Their portraits hung in every barracks. People worked more quickly. Up above they smiled, and their smile was transmitted to hundreds of people down in the excavation." Quoted from Y. Kuzemsko, The Third Lock. KVO Dmitlag publishes 1935. Not to be distributed beyond the boundaries of the camp. Because of the rarities of this edition, we can recommend another combination. Kaganovich, Yagoda, and Khrushchev inspect camps on the Belomor Canal. In D.D. Runes, Despotism, New York, 1963, page 262. And in officially inspired songs, "Yagoda in person leads and teaches us. Keen is his eye and his hand is strong." Their general enthusiasm for the camp way of life led the authors of the collective work to this panegyric. "No matter to what corner of the Soviet Union fate should take us, even if it be the most remote wilderness and backwoods, the imprint of order, of precision, and of conscientiousness marks each Ogpu organization." And what Ogpu organization exists in the Russian backwoods? Only the camps. The camp as a torch of progress. That is the level of this historical source of ours. The editor-in-chief has something to say about this himself. Addressing the last rally of Belomostroy officials on August the 25th, 1933, in the city of Dmitrov, they had already moved over to the Moscow-Volga Canal project, Gorky said, "Ever since 1928, I have watched how the GPU re-educates people." And what this means is that even before his visit to Solovki, even before that boy was shot, ever since, in fact, he first returned to the Soviet Union, he had been watching them. And by then, hardly able to restrain his tears, he addressed the Chekists present. "You devils in woolen overcoats, you yourselves don't know what you have done." And the authors note, the Chekists there merely smiled. They knew what they had done. And Gorky noted the extraordinary modesty of the Chekists in the book itself. This dislike of theirs for publicity was truly a touching trait. The collective authors do not simply keep silent about the deaths on the Belomor Canal during construction. They do not follow the cowardly recipe of half-truths. Instead, they write directly, page 190, that no one died during construction. Probably they calculated it this way. 100,000 started the canal, and 100,000 finished, and that meant they were all alive. They simply forgot about the prisoner transports devoured by the construction in the course of 2 fierce winters. But this is already on the level of the cosine of the cheating engineering profession. The authors see nothing more inspiring than this camp labor. They find in forced labor one of the highest forms of blazing, conscientious creativity. Here is the theoretical basis of re-education. Criminals are the result of the repulsive conditions of former times, and our country is beautiful, powerful, and generous, and it needs to be beautified. In their opinion, all those driven to work on the canal would never have found their paths in life if the employers had not assigned them to unite the White Sea with the Baltic, because, after all, human raw material is immeasurably more difficult to work than wood. What language? What profundity! Who said that? Gorky said it in his book, disputing the verbal trumpery of humanism. And Zoshchenko, with profound insight, wrote, "Reforging, this is not the desire to serve out one's term and be freed." So such suspicions did exist, but is in actual fact a restructuring of the consciousness and the pride of a builder. What a student of man! Did you ever push a canal wheelbarrow, and on a penalty ration, too? This worthy book, constituting the glory of Soviet literature, will be our guide in our judgments about the canal. How did it happen that the Belomor Canal in particular was selected as the first great construction project of the archipelago? Was Stalin forced to this by some kind of exacting economic or military necessity? Looking at the results of the construction, we can answer with assurance that there was none. Was he thus inspired by his spirit of noble rivalry with Peter the Great, who had dragged his fleet over portages along the same route, or with the Emperor Paul, in whose reign the first project for such a canal originated? It seems unlikely the wise man had ever even known of this. Stalin simply needed a great construction project somewhere, which would devour many working hands and many lives, the surplus of people as a result of the liquidation of the kulaks, with the reliability of a gas execution van, but more cheaply, and which would at the same time leave a great monument to his reign of the same general sort as the pyramids. In his favorite slave-owning Orient, from which Stalin derived almost everything in his life, they loved to build great canals. And I can almost see him there, examining with love the map of the north of European Russia, where the largest part of the camps were already situated at that time. And down the center of this region, the sovereign drew a line from sea to sea with the end of his pipe stem. In proclaiming this project, it had to be proclaimed necessarily as urgent, because in those years nothing which was not urgent got done in our country. If it had not been urgent, no one would have believed in its vital importance, and even the prisoners dying beneath the upturned wheelbarrows had to believe in that importance. Because if it had not been urgent, then they would not have been willing to die off and clear the way for the new society. The canal must be built in a short time, and it must be built cheaply. These were Comrade Stalin's instructions. And everyone who was alive then remembers what the orders of Comrade Stalin meant. 20 months. That was the time the great leader allotted his criminals, both for the canal and for their own correction, from September 1931 to April 1933. He was in such a rush he would not even give them 2 full years. 140 miles, rocky soil, an area abounding in boulders, swamps, 7 locks in the Povenets staircase, 12 locks on the descent to the White Sea, and this was no Dneprostroi, which was allowed a long time for completion and allotted foreign exchange. Belomorstroi was entrusted to the Ogpu and received not 1 kopeck in foreign exchange. So the plan looms more and more clearly. This canal was so badly needed by Stalin and the nation that it was not to get 1 kopeck of foreign exchange. Let 100,000 prisoners work for you simultaneously. What capital is more precious? and deliver the canal in 20 months, not 1 day later. That's when you rant and rage at the wrecker engineers. The engineers say, "We will make the structure of concrete." The Czechists reply, "There is not enough time." The engineers say, "We need large quantities of iron." The Czechists reply, "Replace it with wood." The engineers say, "We need tractors, cranes, construction machinery." The Czechists, "There will be none of that, not 1 kopeck of foreign exchange. Do it all by hand." The book calls this the bold Czechist formulation of a technical assignment. In other words, the Rappaport cosign. We were in such a rush that we brought in people from Tashkent for this northern project, hydrotechnologists and irrigation experts, arrested as it happened at the most opportune time. With them a special, once again, special, a favorite word, design bureau was set up on Furkasovsky Lane, behind the big Lubyanka. This was thus one of the very earliest Sharashkas, islands of paradise. At the same time, people mention one other like it, the OKB, the Special Design Bureau at the Izhora factory, which designed the first famous blooming mill for semi-finished steel ingots. Incidentally, the Chekist, Ivanchenko, asked the engineer Zurin, "Why should you make a plan when there already is a plan for the Volga-Don Canal project? Use it instead." We were in such a rush that they were put to work making a plan before surveys had been made on the ground. Of course, we rushed survey crews into Karelia, but not one of the designers was allowed to leave even the bounds of the design office, let alone go to Karelia. This was vigilance, and therefore telegrams flew back and forth. "What kind of an elevation do you have there? What kind of soil?" We were in such a rush that trainloads of Zeks kept on arriving at the canal site before there were any barracks there, or supplies, or tools, or a precise plan. And what was to be done? There were no barracks, but there was an early northern autumn. There were no tools, but the first month of the 20 was already passing. Plus several hidden, tukhta, months of the preliminary organizational period not reported anywhere. We were in such a rush that the engineers who finally arrived at the canal site had no drafting papers, no rulers, no thumbtacks, and not even any light in their work barracks. They worked under kerosene wick lamps, and our authors rave that it was just like during the Civil War. In the jolly tone of inveterate merrymakers, they tell us, women came in silk dresses and were handed a wheelbarrow on the spot. And how many, many encounters there were with old acquaintances in Tunguda, former students, Esperantists, comrades in arms from White Guard detachments. The comrades in arms from the White Guard detachments had long since encountered each other on Solovki, but we are grateful to the authors for the information that Esperantists and students also got their White Sea Canal wheelbarrows. Almost choking with laughter, they tell us, from the Krasnovodsk camps in Central Asia, from Stalinabad, from Samarkand, they brought Turkmenians and Tajiks in their Bukhara robes and turbans here to the Karelian sub-zero winter cold. Now that was something the Basmachi rebels never expected. The norm here was to break up 2.5 cubic yards of granite and to move it a distance of 100 yards in a wheelbarrow. And the snow kept falling and covering everything up, and the wheelbarrows somersaulted off the gangways into the snow. But let the authors themselves speak. The wheelbarrow tottered on the wet planks and turned upside down. A human being with such a wheelbarrow was like a horse in shafts. It took an hour to load a wheelbarrow like this, and not even with granite, merely with frozen soil. Or a more generalized picture. The ugly depression, powdered over with snow, was full of people and stones. People wandered about, tripping over the stones. They bent over, 2 or 3 of them together, and taking hold of a boulder, tried to lift it. The boulder did not move. They called a 4th and a 5th. But at this point, the technology of our glorious century came to their aid. They dragged the boulders out of the excavation with a net. the net being hauled by a cable, and the cable in turn by a drum being turned by a horse. Or here is another method they used, wooden cranes for lifting stones. Or here, for example, are some of the first Belomorstroi machines. And are these your wreckers? No, these are engineering geniuses. They were hurled from the 20th century into the age of the caveman, and lo, they managed to cope with the situation. The basic transportation at Belomorstroi consisted of grabarki, dray carts with boxes mounted on them for carrying earth, as we learn from the book. And in addition, there were also Belomor Fords, and here is what they were. Heavy wooden platforms placed on 4 wooden logs, rollers, and 2 horses dragged this Ford along and carried stones away on it. And a wheelbarrow was handled by a team of 2 men. On slopes it was caught and pulled upward by a hook man, a worker using a hook. And how were trees to be felled if there were neither saws nor axes? Our inventiveness could find the answer to that one. Ropes were tied around the trees, and they were rocked back and forth by brigades pulling in different directions. They rocked the trees out. Our inventiveness can solve any problem at all. And why? Because the canal was being built on the initiative and instructions of Comrade Stalin. This was written in the newspapers and repeated on the radio every day. Just picture this battlefield, with the Chekists in long, ashy grey greatcoats or leather jackets. There were only 37 of them for 100,000 prisoners, but they were loved by all, and this love caused Karelian boulders to move. Here they have paused for a moment. Comrade Frenkel points with his hand, and Comrade Firin chews on his lips, and Comrade Uspensky says nothing. And is this that patricide, that same Solovki butcher? And thereby were decided the fates of thousands of people during that frosty night, or the whole of that Arctic month. The very grandeur of this construction project consisted in the fact that it was carried out without contemporary technology and equipment, and without any supplies from the nation as a whole. These are not the tempos of noxious European-American capitalism. These are socialist tempos, the authors brag. In the 1960s, we will learn that this is called the Great Leap Forward. The whole book praises specifically the backwardness of the technology and the homemade workmanship. There were no cranes, so they will make their own wooden derricks. And the only metal parts the derricks had were in places where there was friction, and these parts they cast themselves. Our own industry at the canal, our authors gloat. And they themselves cast wheelbarrow wheels in their homemade cupola furnace. The country required the canal so urgently and in such haste that it could not even find any wheelbarrow wheels for the project. It would have been too difficult an order for Leningrad factories. No, it would be unjust, most unjust, unfair, to compare this most savage construction project of the 20th century, this continental canal built with wheelbarrow and pick, with the Egyptian pyramids. After all, the pyramids were built with the contemporary technology, and we used the technology of 40 centuries earlier. That's what our gas execution van consisted of. We didn't have any gas for the gas chamber. Just try and be an engineer in these circumstances. All the dikes were earthen. All the floodgates were made of wood. Earth leaks now and then. How can it be made watertight? They drive horses over the dikes with rollers. Stalin and the country were pitiless to horses as well as to prisoners, because horses were a kulak animal and also destined to die. It is also very difficult to eliminate leakage at contact points between earth and wood. Wood had to be used in place of iron, and engineer Maslov invented rhomboid wooden lock gates. There was no concrete used in the walls of the locks, and how could they be strengthened? They remembered the ancient Russian device called ryazhi, cribs of logs fitted and joined, rising 50 feet high and filled with soil. Make use of the technology of the caveman, but bear responsibility according to the rules of the 20th century. If it leaks anywhere, Off with your head. The Iron Commissar Yagoda wrote to Chief Engineer Krustalyev, on the basis of available reports, that is from Stulis and from Kogan, Frenkel, Firin, you are not manifesting and you do not feel the necessary energy and interest in the work. I order you to answer immediately. Do you intend immediately? What language? To set to work in earnest and to compel that portion of the engineers? What portion? Whom? Which is sabotaging and interfering with the work to work conscientiously? Now what could the chief engineer reply to that? He wanted to survive. I admit my criminal softness. I repent of my own slackness. And meanwhile, it is incessantly dinned into our ears. The canal is being built on the initiative and orders of Comrade Stalin. The radio in the barracks, on the canal site by the stream, in a Karelian hut on a truck, the radio which sleeps neither day nor night. Just imagine it. Those innumerable black mouths, those black masks without eyes, imagery, cry out incessantly, what do the Chekists of the whole country think about the canal project? What does the party have to say about it? And you too better think the same. You too better think the same. Nature we will teach, and freedom we will reach. Hail socialist competition and the shock worker movement. Competition between work brigades. Competition between phalanxes, from 250 to 300 persons. Competition between labor collectives. Competition between locks. And then, finally, the Vokrovtsi, the militarized camp guards, entered into competition with the Zeks. And the obligation of the Vokrovtsi to guard you better. But the main reliance was, of course, on the socially friendly elements. In other words, the thieves. These concepts had already merged at the canal. Deeply touched, Gorky shouted to them from the rostrum, after all, any capitalist steals more than all of you combined. The thieves roared with approval, flattered. And big tears glistened in the eyes of a former pickpocket. They counted on being able to make use of the lawbreaker's romanticism in the construction. And why shouldn't the thieves have been flattered? A thief says from the presidium of the rally, we didn't receive any bread for 2 days, but there was nothing awful in that for us. After all, they could always plunder someone else. What is precious to us is that people talk to us like human beings, which is something the engineers cannot boast of. There are such crags in our path that the drills break. That's all right, we manage them. What do they manage them with? And who manages them? This is class theory. Friendly elements against alien elements as the basis of the camp. It has never been reported how brigadiers at Belomor ate, but at Berezniki, an eyewitness, IDT, says there was a separate kitchen for the brigadiers, all thieves, and rations, better than in the army, so that their fists would get strong and they would know for what to put the squeeze on. At the second camp there was thievery, grabbing dishes from the prisoners, and also ration tickets for gruel. But the thieves were not expelled from the ranks of shock workers on that account. It did not cast a shadow on their social image or their productive drive. They brought the food to the work sites cold. They stole clothes from the drivers. That was all right. We'll manage. Povenets was a penalty site, chaos and confusion. They baked no bread in Povenets, but brought it all the way from Kem. Look at the map. On the Shizhnya section, the food norm was not provided. It was cold in the barracks, there was an infestation of lice, and people were ill. Never mind. We'll manage. The canal is being constructed on the initiative of KVBs. Cultural and educational battle points were everywhere. A hooligan no more than arrived in camp than he immediately became an instructor. An atmosphere of constant battle alert was created. All of a sudden, a night of storm assault was proclaimed, a blow against bureaucracy. And right at the end of the evening work, the cultural instructors went around the administration rooms and took by storm. All of a sudden, there was a breakthrough, not of water, of percentages, on the Tunguda section. Storm attack, it was decided, to double the work norms. Really? All of a sudden, without any warning, some brigade or other has fulfilled its day's plan by 852%. Just try to understand that. So a universal day of records is proclaimed, a blow against tempo interrupters. Bonus pirozhki are distributed to a brigade. Why such haggard faces? The longed-for moment, but no gladness. It seemed that everything was going well. In the summer of 1932, Yagoda, the provider, inspected the entire route and was satisfied. But in December he sent a telegram. "The norms are not being fulfilled. The idle loafing of thousands of people must be ended." This you believe, this you see. The labor collectives are dragging their way to work with faded banners. It has been learned that, according to the communiques, 100% of the total amount of earth to be moved to build the canal has already been excavated several times over, yet the canal has not been finished. Negligent sloggers have been filling the log cribs with ice instead of stone and earth, and this will melt in the spring and the water will break through. There are new slogans for the instructors. Tufta is the most dangerous weapon of counter-revolution. I accept F in Tufta here instead of KH, only because I am quoting. And it was the thieves most of all who engaged in Tufta. Filling the cribs with ice was plainly their trick. And there was one more slogan. The cheater is a class enemy. And the thieves were entrusted with the task of going around to expose Tufta and verify the work done by KR brigades. The best way for them to claim as their own the work of the KR brigades. Tufta is an attempt to destroy the entire corrective labor policy of the Ogpu. That's how awful this Tufta is. Tufta is the theft of socialist property. That's how terrible that Tufta is. In February 1933, they rearrested engineers who had been released early because of the Tufta they'd discovered. There was such élan, such enthusiasm. So whence had come this Tufta? Why had the prisoners thought it up? Evidently they were betting on the restoration of capitalism. Things hadn't gone that way here without the white emigration's black hand being present. At the beginning of 1933, there was a new order from Yagoda. All administrations were to be renamed Staffs of Battle Sectors. 50% of the administrative staffs were to be thrown into construction work. Would there be enough spades? They were to work in 3 shifts. The night was nearly polar. They would be fed right on canal site, with cold food. For Tufta, they would be put on trial. In January came the storm of the watershed. All the phalanxes with their kitchens and property were to be thrown into one single sector. There were not enough tents for everyone. They slept out on the snow. Never mind. We'll manage. The canal is being built on the initiative of. From Moscow came order number 1, to proclaim a general storm attack until the completion of construction. At the end of the working day, they drove stenographers, office workers, laundresses onto the canal site. In February, there was a prohibition on all visits from relatives for the entire Belomor camp system, either because of the danger of typhus or else because of pressure on the Zeks. In April, there was an incessant 48-hour storm assault. Hurrah! 30,000 people did not sleep. And by May the 1st, 1933, People's Commissar Yagoda reported to his beloved teacher that the canal had been completed on time. In July 1933, Stalin, Voroshilov, and Kirov undertook a pleasant excursion on a steamer to inspect the canal. There is a photograph that shows them sitting on deck in wicker armchairs, joking, laughing, smoking. Meanwhile, Kirov was already doomed, but did not know it. In August, the 120 writers made their excursion through the canal. There were no people in the area to service and operate the canal, and so they sent dispossessed kulaks, special deportees, and Berman himself picked the places for their settlements. A large part of the Canal Army men went on to build the next canal, the Moscow-Volga Canal. At the August rally of the Canal army men, Lazar Kogan proclaimed, "Not far off is the rally which will be the last in the camp system. Not far off is that year, month, and day when by and large corrective labor camps will not be needed." He himself was probably shot, and never did find out how sadly mistaken he was. And maybe when he said it, he did not believe it. Let us turn away from the scoffing collective writers' volume. No matter how gloomy the Solzhenitsyn Islands seemed, the Solzhenitsyn Islanders, who were sent off on prisoner transports to end their terms, and often their lives, on the Belomor Canal, only there really came to feel that joking had ended, only there discovered what a genuine camp was like, something which all of us gradually came to know later. Instead of the quiet of Solovki, there were incessant mother oaths, and the savage din of quarreling mingled with indoctrinational propaganda. Even in the barracks of the Medvezhyogorsk camp in the administration of Beltlag, people slept on vagonki, double-tiered wooden bunks anchored in pairs, already invented, not just by fours but by eights, 2 on each single bunk panel, head by feet. Instead of stone monastery buildings, there were drafty temporary barracks, even tents, and sometimes people out on the bare snow. And those transferred from Berezniki, where they had also worked a 12-hour day, found it was worse here. Days of work records, nights of storm assaults. From us everything, to us nothing. Many were crippled and killed in the crowding and chaos in the course of dynamiting rocky crags. Gruel that had grown cold was eaten among the boulders. We have already read what the work was like. What kind of food? Well, what kind could there have been in 1931 to 1933? Anna Skripnikova reports that even in the Medvezhyogorsk mess hall for free voluntary employees, they served only a murky dishwater with fish heads and individual millet grains. However, she recalls that refugees from the Ukraine came to Medvezhyogorsk in order to get work near the camp, and by this means saved themselves from starvation. The Zeks called them over and brought some of their own food from the camp compound for them to eat. And all this is very likely, but not all were able to escape from the Ukraine. Their clothing was their own and was worn till it was worn out. And there was only one form of address, one form of urging them on, one refrain. Come on! Come on! Come on! They say that in the first winter, 1931 to 1932, 100,000 died off, a number equal to the number of those who made up the full working forces on the canal. And why not believe it? More likely, it is an understatement. In similar conditions in wartime camps, a death rate of 1% per day was commonplace and common knowledge. So, on Belomor, 100,000 could have died off in just 3 months plus. And then there was another whole summer and another winter. D.P. Vitkovsky, a Solzhenitsyn Islands veteran, who worked on the White Sea Canal as a work supervisor and saved the lives of many prisoners with that very same tukhta, the falsification of work reports, draws a picture of the evenings. At the end of the workday, there were corpses left on the worksite. The snow powdered their faces. One of them was hunched over beneath an overturned wheelbarrow. He had hidden his hands in his sleeves and frozen to death in that position. Someone had frozen with his head bent down between his knees. 2 were frozen back to back, leaning against each other. They were peasant lads and the best workers one could possibly imagine. They were sent to the canal in tens of thousands at a time, and the authorities tried to work things out so no one got to the same sub-camp as his father. They tried to break up families, and right off they gave them norms of shingle and boulders that you'd be unable to fulfill even in summer. No one was able to teach them anything, to warn them, and in their village simplicity they gave all their strength to their work and weakened very swiftly and then froze to death, embracing in pairs. At night the sledges went out and collected them. The drivers threw the corpses onto the sledges with a dull clonk. And in the summer bones remained from corpses which had not been removed in time, and together with the shingle they got into the concrete mixer. And in this way they got into the concrete of the last block of the city of Belomorsk, and will be preserved there forever. The Belomorskroy newspaper choked with enthusiasm in describing how many Canal army men who had been aesthetically carried away by their great task had in their own free time, and obviously without any payment in bread, decorated the canal banks with stones, simply for the sake of beauty. Yes, and it was quite right for them to set forth on the banks of the canal the names of the 6 principal lieutenants of Stalin and Yagoda, the chief overseers of Belomor, 6 hired murderers, each of whom accounted for 30,000 lives, Firin, Bellman, Frenkel, Kogan, Rapoport, Zhuk. Yes, and they should have added there the chief of VOKHR of Belbaltlag, Brodsky. Yes, and the curator of the canal representing VTSIK, Solz. Yes, and all the 37 Chekists who were at the canal, and the 36 writers who glorified Belomor, including Alexei N. Tolstoy, who after he had travelled over the canal, he had to pay for his position, recounted with excitement and inspiration what he had seen, drawing attractive, almost fantastic, and at the same time realistic pictures of the prospects of the future of the region, putting into his narrative all the heat of his creative passion and writer's imagination. He literally bubbled with enthusiasm in speaking of the labor of the canal builders, of the advanced technology. And the dramatist Pogodin should not be forgotten either, so that tourists on steamers would read and think about them. But that's the rub. There are no tourists. How can that be? Just like that. And there are no steamers either. There is nothing there that goes on a schedule. In 1966, when I was completing this book, I wanted to travel through the great Belomor to see it for myself, just so as to compete with those 120 others. But it was impossible. There was nothing to make the trip on. I would have had to ask for passage on a freighter, and on such vessels they check your papers, and I have a name which has been attacked. There would immediately be suspicion. Why was I going? And therefore, so that the book remained safe, it was wiser not to go. But nonetheless I did poke around there a bit. First at Medvezhyagorsk. Even at the present time, many of the barracks have still survived. Also a majestic hotel with a 5-story glass tower. For after all, this was the gateway to the canal. After all, things would buzz here with Soviet and foreign visitors. But it stayed empty forever and ever, and finally they turned it over to a boarding school. The road to Povinets, stunted woods, stones at every step, boulders. From Povinets I reached the canal straight away and walked along it for a long stretch, keeping as close as possible to the locks so as to look them over. This book is continued at this point, on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 3, Side 2. From Povinets I reached the canal straight away and walked along it for a long stretch, keeping as close as possible to the locks so as to look them over. Forbidden zones, sleepy guards. But in some places things were clearly visible. The walls of the locks were just what they had been before, made from those very same rock-filled cribs. I could recognize them from their pictures. But Maslov's rhomboid gates had been replaced by metal gates and were no longer opened by hand. But why was everything so quiet? There were no people about. There was no traffic on the canal, nor in the locks. There was no hustle and bustle of service personnel. There were no steamer whistles. The lock gates stayed shut. It was a fine, serene June day, so why was it? And so it was that I passed 5 locks of the Povinets staircase, and after passing the 5th, I sat down on the bank. Portrayed on all our Belomor cigarette packages, and so desperately needed by our country, "Why are you silent, great canal?" Someone in civilian clothing approached me with watchful eyes, so I played the simpleton. Where could I get some fish? Yes, and how could I leave via the canal? He turned out to be the chief of the lock's guard. Why, I asked him, wasn't there any passenger traffic? Well, he acted astonished. How could we? After all, the Americans would rush right over to see it. Until the war there had been passenger traffic, but not since the war. Well, what if they did come and see it? Well, now, how could we let them see it? But why is no one travelling on it? They do, but not very many. You see, it is very shallow, 16 feet deep. They wanted to rebuild it, but in all probability they will build another next to it, one which will be all right from the beginning. You don't say, boss. We've long since known all about that. In 1934, no sooner had they finished passing out all the metals than there was already a project for reconstructing it. And point number one was to deepen the canal, and the second was to build a deep-water chain of locks for sea-going ships parallel to the existing locks. Haste makes waste. Because of that time limit imposed on its completion, because of those norms, they not only cheated on the depth, but reduced the tonnage capacity. There had to be some faked cubic feet in order to feed the sloggers. And very soon afterward they blamed this cheating on the engineers and gave them new tenors. And 50 miles of the Murmansk Railroad had to be removed to make room for the canal route. It was at least a good thing that they hadn't wasted any wheelbarrow wheels on the project. And what were they to haul on it anyway? And where? They had cut down all the nearby timber, so where was it to be hauled from? Was Archangel timber to be hauled to Leningrad? But it was sold right in Archangel. Foreigners had been buying it there since long ago. Yes, for half the year the canal is frozen anyhow, maybe more. So what was it needed for, anyway? Oh, yes, there was a military necessity in order to be able to shift the fleet. It's so shallow, complained the chief of the guard, that not even submarines can pass through it under their own power. They have to be loaded on barges, and only then can they be hauled through. And what about the cruisers? Oh, you hermit tyrant, you night-time lunatic. In what nightmare did you dream up all this? And where, cursed one, were you hurrying to? What was it that burned and pricked you to set a deadline of 20 months? For those 250,000 men could have remained alive. Well, so the Esperantists stuck in your throat, but think how much work those peasant lads could have done for you. How many times you could have roused them to attack, for the motherland, for Stalin. It was very costly, I said to the guard. But it was built very quickly, he answered me with self-assurance. Your bones should be in it. That day I spent 8 hours by the canal. During this time there was one self-propelled barge which passed from Povinets to Soroka, and one identical in type which passed from Soroka to Povinets. Their numbers were different, and it was only by their numbers that I could tell them apart, and be sure that it was not the same one as before on its way back. Because they were loaded altogether identically, with the very same pine logs which had been lying exposed for a long time, and were useless for anything except firewood. And cancelling the one load against the other, we get 0. And 250,000 to be remembered. And after the White Sea-Baltic Canal came the Moscow-Volga Canal. The sloggers all moved over to it immediately, as well as Chief of Camp Firin and Chief of Construction Kogan. Their orders of Lenin for Belomor reached both of them there. But this canal was at least needed, and it gloriously continued and developed all the traditions of Belomor, and we can understand even better here how the archipelago in the period of rapid metastasis differed from stagnant Solovki. Now was the time to remember and regret the silent cruelties of Solovki, for now they not only demanded work of the prisoners, they not only demanded that the prisoners break up the unyielding rocks with their failing picks. No, while taking away life, they even earlier crawled into the breast and searched the soul. And this was the most difficult thing to bear on the canals. They demanded that in addition to everything else, you chirp. You might be on your last legs, but you had to make a pretensive participation in public affairs. With a tongue growing numb from hunger, you had to deliver speeches demanding over-fulfillment of plan and exposure of records, and punishment for hostile propaganda, for kulak rumors, and all camp rumors were kulak rumors, and to be on the lookout to make sure that the snakes of mistrust did not entwine a new prison term about you. Picking up these shameless books, where the life of the doomed is portrayed so glossily and with such admiration, It is almost impossible to believe that they were written in all seriousness and also read in all seriousness. Yes, and circumspect Glovelet destroyed the printings, so that in this case, too, we got one of the last existing copies. And now our Virgil will be the assiduous pupil of Wyszynski, I.L. Averbach. Even driving in a single screw takes at first some special effort. The axis must be kept straight, and the screw has to be kept from leaning to one side. But when it has already begun to take hold, one can then free one hand and just keep screwing it in, whistling. We read Wyszynski. Thanks in particular to its educational task, our corrective labor camp, ITL, is fundamentally counterposed to the bourgeois prison where raw violence reigns. In contrast to bourgeois states, the use of violence in the struggle against crime plays a role of secondary importance, and the center of gravity has passed over to organizational, material, cultural, educational, and political indoctrinational measures. You really have to furrow your brains not to burst out, instead of the club, the Ration Scale, plus propaganda. And here is some more. The success of socialism also exercised their magical, that's what's sculpted there, magical, influence on the struggle against crime. Following in his teacher's footsteps, Averbach similarly elaborates, the task of Soviet corrective labor policy is the transformation of the nastiest human material. Do you remember raw material? Do you remember insects? A.S. Into worthwhile, fully useful, active, and conscientious builders of socialism. There is just the question of that little coefficient. 250,000 of nasty material lay down and died, and 12,500 of the active and conscientious were liberated ahead of time. Belomor. Yes, and wasn't it back at the 8th Party Congress in 1919, when the Civil War was still blazing, when they were still waiting for Denikin near Orel, when Kronstadt and the Tambov Revolt were still in the future, that the Congress declared and determined to replace the system of punishments, in other words, in general not to punish anyone at all, with a system of education? Compulsory, Averbach now adds. And rhetorically, already saving up for us the annihilating reply, he asks, but how else? How can one remake consciousness for the benefit of socialism if in freedom it has already become hostile to it, and camp compulsion is perceived as violence and can only intensify the hostility? So we and the reader are caught in a blind alley. Is it not true? But that's not the end of it, and now he is going to dazzle us blind. Productive, meaningful labor with a high purpose. That's the means by which all hostile or unreliable consciousness will be remade. And for that, it seems, we need to concentrate our work on gigantic projects which astound the imagination with their grandeur. Ah, so that's it. That's why we need Belomor, and we dunderheads didn't understand a thing. By this means are attained immediacy, effectiveness, and the pathos of construction. And at the same time, work from zero to completion is obligatory, and every camp inmate, who is not yet dead as of today, feels the political resonance of his personal labor, the interest of the entire country in his work. Please notice how smoothly the screw is now going in.
Perhaps it is a bit crooked, but are we not losing the capacity to resist it?
The father marked a line on the map with his pipe, and is there some anxiety about justifying him? And Averbach always turns up. Andrei Yanuarievich, here is an idea I've had. What do you think about it? Should I develop it in a book? But those are only frills. What was required was that the prisoner, while still confined in camp, be indoctrinated in the highest socialist forms of labor. And what was required for that? The screw had gotten stuck. What muddle-headedness! Of course, socialist competition and the shock worker movement. What millennium is it, darlings, out of doors? Not just work, but heroic work. Ogpu Order number 190. Competition for temporary possession of the red banner of the central staff, of the district staff, of the division staff. competition between camps, construction sites, brigades. Along with the transferable red banner, a brass band was also awarded. For whole days at a time it played for the winners during work periods and during periods of tasty food. There is no tasty food to be seen in the photograph, but you can see the searchlight. That was for night work. The Moscow-Volga Canal was constructed around the clock. A band was used in other camps as well. They put it on the shore, and it played for several days in a row until prisoners working without relief or rest periods had unloaded timber from a barge. IDT was in a band at Belomor, and he recalls, "The band aroused anger among those working. After all, the musicians were released from general work, had their own individual cots and their own military uniforms. They used to shout at us, 'Parasites, drones, come here and get to work.' In the photograph, neither this nor anything like it is shown." In every brigade of prisoners, there was a troika concerned with competition, audit and resolutions, resolutions and audit. The results of the storm assault on the watershed for the first 5-day period. For the second, the intercamp newspaper was called Perikovka, Reforging. Its slogan was, "Let us drown our past on the bottom of the canal." Its appeal, "Work without days off." Universal enthusiasm, universal agreement. The leading shock worker said, "Of course, how can there be days off? The Volga doesn't have days off, and it's just about to overflow its banks. And what about days off on the Mississippi? Grab him, he's a Kulak agent. A point in the obligations undertaken. Preservation of health by every member of the collective." Oh, what humanitarianism. No, here's what it was for. To reduce the amount of absenteeism. Do not be ill and do not take time off. Red bulletin boards, black bulletin boards of charts, days remaining until completion, work done yesterday, work done today. The honor roll. In every barracks, honor certificates. A bulletin board of reforging, graphs, diagrams. And how many loafers were scurrying about and writing all this stuff? Every prisoner had to be informed about the production plans. And every prisoner had to be informed about the entire political life of the country. Therefore, at morning line-up, taken out of morning free time, of course, there was a 5-minute production session. And after returning to camp, when one's legs could hardly keep one upright, there was a 5-minute political session. During lunch hours, prisoners were not to be allowed to crawl into nooks and crannies or to sleep. There were political readings. If, out in freedom, the 6 conditions of Comrade Stalin were proclaimed, then every camp inmate had to learn them by heart. It is worth noting that intellectuals who had managed to make their way up to positions in management took advantage of these 6 conditions very adroitly. To make use of specialists by every possible means meant to yank engineers off general work. Not to permit turnover in the workforce meant to prohibit prisoner transports. If in freedom there was a decree of the Council of People's Commissars on dismissing workers for absenteeism, then here explanatory work had to be undertaken. Every person who today refuses to work or who simulates illness must, after his liberation, be branded with the contempt of the masses of the Soviet Union. The system here was this. In order to get the title of shock worker, it was not enough merely to have production successes. It was necessary, in addition, A, to read the newspapers, B, to love your canal, C, to be able to talk about its significance. And miracle, oh transfiguration and ascension, the shock worker ceases to feel discipline and labor as something which has been forced on him from outside. Even horses understand this. It becomes an inner necessity. Well, truly, of course, freedom, after all, is not freedom, but accepted bars. New socialist forms of reward. The issuing of shock workers' buttons. And what would you have thought? What would you have thought? The shock workers' button is valued by the sloggers more highly than rations. Yes, more highly than rations. And whole brigades voluntarily go out to work 2 hours before line-up. What presumption, But what was the convoy to do? And they also stayed behind to work after the end of the workday. Oh, flame, oh, matches, they thought you would burn for decades. Here it is, shock work. A thunderstorm breaks, but we are going to work anyway. We are going to over-fulfill the day's plan. Remark the technology. We spoke of it at the Bellamore, too. On the slopes, a hookman hauls the wheelbarrow from the front. Indeed, how else could it be made to roll upward? Ivan Nemtsev suddenly decided to do the work of 5 men. No sooner said than done. He moved 72 cubic yards of earth in one shift. Let us calculate. That is 6.5 cubic yards per hour. 1 cubic yard every 9 minutes. Just try it, even with the lightest type of soil. This was the situation. There were no pumps, no wells had been readied, and water had to be fought off with one's hands. And what about the women? They used to lift, unaided, stones of up to 150 pounds. Wheelbarrows overturned and stones struck head and feet. That's all right. We'll manage. Sometimes up to their waists in water, sometimes 62 hours of unbroken work, sometimes for 3 days 500 persons hacked to the frozen earth. And it turned out to be to no avail. That's all right. We'll manage. With our battle spades we dug our happiness near Moscow. This was that same special gay tension they had brought with them from Bellamore. They went on the attack with boisterous gay songs. In any weather, march out to line up. And here are the shock workers themselves. They have come to the rally. On one side, by the train, is the chief of convoy, and on the left there is one more convoy guard. Look at their inspired and happy faces. These women do not think about children nor about home, but only about the canal which they have come to love so. It is quite cold, and some are in felt boots, some are in ordinary boots, homemade, of course, and the second from the left in the first row is a woman thief in stolen shoes, and where better to go swaggering about in them than at the rally. And here is another rally. It says on the poster, "We will build it ahead of time, cheaply and strong." And how do we reconcile all that? Well, let the engineers break their heads over it. It is easy to see in the photograph that there are shadows of smiles for the camera, but in general these women are terribly fatigued. They are not going to make speeches, and all they expect from the rally is a nourishing meal for once. All of them have simple, peasant-like faces. All the photographs are from Averbach's book. He warned that there were no photographs of kulaks and wreckers in it, in other words, of the finest peasants and intellectuals. Evidently, so to speak, their time has not yet come. Alas, it never will. You can't bring back the dead. And the trusty guard got stuck in the aisle, the Judas he so much wanted to get into that photograph. And here is a shock brigade provided with the last word in equipment. It is not true that we haul everything under our own steam. If we are to believe the camp artists whose works were exhibited in the KVCH, the Cultural and Educational section, then this is the equipment already in use at the canal. 1 excavator, 1 crane, and 1 tractor. Are they in working order? Perhaps they're broken down. Isn't that more likely? Well, generally speaking, in winter it isn't very cozy out on the construction site, right? There was one small additional problem. At the time Bellamore was completed, too many triumphant articles appeared in various newspapers, and they nullified the terrorizing effects of the camps. In the description of Bellamore, they overdid it to such a degree that those who arrived at the Moscow-Volga Canal expected rivers of milk and honey, and presented unheard-of demands to the administration. Presumably they asked for clean linen? So that was it. Go ahead and lie as much as you please, but don't get entangled in your lying. Today, too, the banner of Bellamore waves over us, writes the newspaper Reforging. That's a moderate statement, and it is quite enough. In any event, both at Bellamore and at the Moscow-Volga Canal, they understood that camp competition and the shock worker movement must be tied in with the entire system of rewards, so that the special rewards would stimulate the shock worker movement. The principal basis of competition is material incentive.
It would seem we've been thrown about face. We have turned from east to west, 180 degrees.
Is this a provocation? Hold tight to the handrails. The car is going through. And things worked out like this. On production indices depended nutrition and housing and clothing and linen and the frequency of baths. Yes, whoever works badly can go about in tatters and lice. And liberation ahead of time, and rest days, and visits. For example, issuing a shock worker's lapel button is purely a socialist form of encouragement. But let that button confer the right to a long visit out of turn. And by this means it becomes more precious than bread rations. If, in freedom, in accordance with the Soviet Constitution, we apply the principle of whoever does not work does not eat, then why should we put the camp inmates in a privileged position? The most difficult thing in organizing a camp, they must not become privileged places. The ration scale at Dmitlag was this. The penalty ration consisted of muddy water and 10.5 ounces of bread. 100% fulfillment of norm earned the right to 28 ounces of bread, and the right to buy, in addition, 3.5 ounces in the camp commissary. And then, submission to discipline begins out of egotistical motives, self-interest in getting a better bread ration, and rises to the second step of socialist self-interest in the red banner. In his private life, Aberbach probably began immediately with the second step. But the main thing was time off sentence. Time off sentence. The Socialist Competition Headquarters compiled a report on the prisoner. For time off sentence, not only over-fulfillment of plan is required, but also social work. And anyone who in the past has been a non-working element gets reduced time off sentence, miserly small. Such a person can only pretend, not reform. He must be kept in camp longer, so as to be verified. For example, he pushes a wheelbarrow uphill, and maybe he isn't working but just pretending. And what do those who are freed ahead of time do? What do you mean, what? They stay with the project. They have come to love the Canal too much to leave it. They are so absorbed in it that when they are liberated, they voluntarily stay at the Canal, engaging in earth-moving operations right to the end of the project. They voluntarily remain at work like that. Can one believe the author? Of course. After all, they all have a stamp in their passport. Was in Ogpu camps. You aren't going to find work anywhere else. But what is this? The machinery for producing nightingale trills has suddenly broken down, and in the intermission we hear the weary breath of truth. Even the thieves were only 60% involved in competition. It is pretty bad if even the thieves don't compete. The camp inmates often interpret the special benefits and rewards as incorrectly applied. Recommendations of prisoners are often composed tritely. Very often, trustees pass themselves off on recommendations as shock worker excavators and receive a shock worker's time-off sentence, while the real shock worker often gets none. In our country, everything is topsy-turvy, and even rewards sometimes turn out to be a misfortune. The blacksmith Paramonov received 2 years off his 10-year sentence in one of the Archangel camps for the excellence of his work. But because of this 2-year reduction, he completed his term during wartime, and as a result, being a 58, he was not released, but was kept there under special decree. Special, once again. Just as soon as the war was over, Paramonov's co-defendants, convicted with him in the same case, completed their 10-year sentences and were released, and he dragged out another whole year. The prosecutor studied his case and couldn't do a thing. The special decree remained in force throughout the entire archipelago. And so it would seem, gentlemen instructors, that it was you who had not managed to rise to the second step. And there were many who clung to feelings of hopelessness and injustice.
Well, and in 1931, the Fifth Conference of Justice officials condemned this whole snake pit. The widespread and totally unjustified application of parole and time-off sentence for workdays leads to diminution of the impact of sentences, to the undermining of the repression of crime, and to distortions in the class line.
But the trills have begun again with a metallic ring. The main incentive had evidently been forgotten. Cruel and merciless application of disciplinary penalties. Ogpu Order of November 28, 1933. This was at the beginning of winter, so they would stand still without rocking back and forth. All incorrigible loafers and malingerers are to be sent to distant northern camps with total deprivation of rights to any privileges. Malicious strikers and troublemakers are to be turned over to trial by camp collegia. For the slightest attempt to violate iron discipline, prisoners are to be deprived of all special privileges and advantages already received. For example, for attempting to get warm beside the fire. And nonetheless, we have again omitted the main link, total confusion. We have said everything, but we didn't say the main thing. Listen, listen. Collectivity is both the principle and the method of Soviet corrective labor policy. After all, there have to be driving belts from the administration to the masses. Only by basing itself on collectives can the multitudinous camp administration rework the consciousness of the prisoners. From the lowest forms of collective responsibility to the highest forms is a matter of honor, a matter of glory, a matter of valor and heroism. We often abuse our language, claiming that with the passage of the ages it has grown pale. But if one really thinks about this, it is not true. It becomes more noble. Earlier, in the manner of cabmen, we said reins, and now driving belts. It used to be called mutual back-scratching. You help me out of the ditch, and I'll help you out of the swamp. But that smells of the stable, too. And now it's collective responsibility. The brigade is the basic form of re-education. Gulag Order, 1933. This means trust in the collective, which is impossible under capitalism, but which is quite possible under feudalism. One man in the village is at fault, strip them all and whip them. Nonetheless, it sounds noble. Trust in the collective. That means the spontaneous initiative of the camp inmates in the cause of re-education. This is psychological enrichment of the personality by the collective. No, what words, what words. After all, he's knocked us right down with this psychological enrichment. Now there's a real scholar for you. The collective heightens the feeling of human dignity. Yes, yes, of every prisoner, and by this means hinders the introduction of a system of moral repression. And indeed, please tell me, 30 years after Averbach, it was my fate to say a word or so about the brigade. All I did was describe how things worked there, but people managed to understand me in quite the opposite sense, in a distorted way. The brigade is the basic contribution of communism to the science of punishment. And that is quite right. That is precisely what Averbach is saying. It is a collective organism, living, working, eating, sleeping, and suffering together in pitiless and forced symbiosis. Ernst Powell, The Triumph of Survival, The Nation, February the 2nd, 1963. Oh, without the brigade, one could still somehow manage to survive the camp. Without the brigade, you are an individual. You yourself choose your own line of conduct. Without the brigade, you can at least die proudly. But in the brigade, the only way they allow you even to die is in humiliation on your belly. From the chief, from the camp foreman, from the jailer, from the convoy guard, from all of them you can hide and catch a moment of rest. You can ease up a bit here on hauling, shirk a bit there on lifting. But from the driving belts, from your comrades in the brigade, there is neither a hiding place nor salvation nor mercy. You cannot not want to work. You cannot, conscious of being a political preferred death from hunger, to work. No, once you have been marched outside the compound, once you have been registered as going out to work, everything the brigade does today will be divided not by 25, but by 26. And because of you, the entire brigade's percentage of norm will fall from 123 to 119, which makes the difference between the ration allotted record breakers and ordinary rations. And everyone will lose a millet cake and 3½ ounces of bread. And that is why your comrades keep watch on you better than any jailers. and the brigade leader's fist will punish you far more effectively than the whole People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. Now that is what spontaneous initiative in re-education means. That is psychological enrichment of the personality by the collective. So now it is all as transparent as a window pane. Yet on the Moscow-Volga Canal, even the organizers themselves still did not dare believe what a strong dog collar they had found. And there the brigade was kept in the background, and the labor collective was elevated to the position of highest honor and incentive. Even in May 1934, half the Zeks in Dmitlag were still unorganized. They were not accepted in the labor collectives. They did take them into labor cooperatives, but not all of them. They did not take in priests, sectarians, or other religious believers. Unless they renounced their religion, the game was worth the candle, in which case they were accepted with 1 month's probation. They began to take 58s into the labor collectives unwillingly, but only those whose terms were less than 5 years. The collective had a chairman, a council, and the democracy there was quite unbridled. The meetings of the collective took place only with the permission of the KVCH, the Cultural and Educational Section, and only in the presence of the company, yes, indeed, they had companies too, instructor. It goes without saying that the collectives were given higher rations than the mob. The best collectives had vegetable gardens allotted to them in the compound, not to individual people, but, as on a collective farm, to supplement the common pot. The collectives split into sections, and every free hour was filled with either checking the daily living routine or inquests into thefts and the squandering of government property, of publication of a wall newspaper, or delving into disciplinary violations. At the meetings of the collectives they spent hours in pretentious discussion of such questions as how to reforge Lazy Bones Volga, or Grishka, the malingerer. The collective itself had the right to expel its own members and ask that they be deprived of time-off sentence. But, as a more drastic measure, the administration could dissolve entire collectives which were continuing criminal traditions, which were not, in other words, immersed in collective life. However, the most entertaining were the periodic purges of the collectives, of loafers, of the unworthy, of whisperers, who depicted the labor collectives as organizations for spying on one another, and of agents of the class enemy who had crept into their midst. For example, it was discovered that someone, already in camp, was concealing his kulak descent, for which he had, in fact, been sent to camp in the first place. And so now he was branded and purged not from the camp, but from the labor collective. Realist artists, please paint that picture. The purge in the labor collective. Those shaven heads, those watchful expressions, those fatigued faces, those rags on the body, and those enraged orators. Right here is a prototype. And for those who find it hard to imagine, well, this sort of thing took place in freedom too, and in China. And listen to this. As a preliminary, the task and the purposes of the purge were communicated to every camp inmate, and at that point every member of the collective gave public accounting. All the citations not otherwise credited are from Averbach's book, but sometimes I have combined phrases from different places, sometimes passed over his intolerable prolixity. After all, he had to stretch it out into a dissertation, but we don't have the space. However, I have nowhere distorted the meaning. And then, too, there was exposure of fake shock workers, and elections of the Cultural Council, and official rebukes to those who had done poorly at liquidating their illiteracy. And there were the classes in liquidation of illiteracy, too. We are not slaves, slaves we are not. And the songs, too. This kingdom of swamps and lowlands will become our happy native land. Or, in the masterful words of Nikolai Asayev, the poet himself, we Canal army men are a tough people, but not in that lies our chief trait. We were caught up by a great epoch, to be put on the path that leads straight. Or, at the amateur theatricals, bursting from the breast. And even the most beautiful song cannot tell, no, cannot do justice to this country than which there is nothing more wondrous, the country in which you and I live. Songbooks of Dmitlag, 1935, and the music was called Canal Army Music, and there were free composers on the competition committee, Shostakovich, Kabalevsky, Schechter. Now that is what to chirp means in camp slang. Oh, they will drive you to the point where you will weep just to be back with Company Commander Kurilko, walking along the short and simple execution road, through open and above-board Solovki slavery. My Lord, what canal is there deep enough for us to drown that past in? Chapter 4. The archipelago hardens, and the clock of history was striking. In 1934, at the January plenum of the Central Committee and Central Control Commission of the Soviet Communist Party, the great leader, having already in mind, no doubt, how many he would soon have to do away with, declared that the withering away of the state, which had been awaited virtually from 1920 on, would arrive via, believe it or not, the maximum intensification of state power. This was so unexpectedly brilliant that it was not given to every little mind to grasp it, but Vyshinsky, ever the loyal apprentice, immediately picked it up. And this means the maximum strengthening of corrective labor institutions. Entry into socialism via the maximum strengthening of prison. And this was not some satirical magazine cracking a joke either, but was said by the Prosecutor General of the Soviet Union. And thus it was that the iron grip of the Yezhov terror was prepared even without Yezhov. After all, the second 5-year plan, and who remembers this? For no one in our country ever remembers anything, for memory is the Russians' weak spot, especially memory of the bad. The second 5-year plan included among its glistening, and to this very day unfulfilled, goals the following: the uprooting of the vestiges of capitalism from people's consciousness. This meant that this process of uprooting had to be finished by 1938. Judge for yourself. By what means were these vestiges to be so swiftly uprooted? Soviet places of confinement on the threshold of the second 5-year plan not only are not losing, but are even gaining in significance. Not 1 year had passed since Kogan's predictions that camps would soon cease to exist at all, but Kogan did not know about the January plenum. In the epoch of entrance into socialism, the role of corrective labor institutions as weapons of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as organs of repression, as means of compulsion and education — compulsion is already in the first place — must grow still further and be strengthened. For otherwise, what was to happen to the command corps of the NKVD? Was it just supposed to disappear? So who is going to reproach our progressive doctrine with having fallen behind practice? All this was printed in black on white, but we still didn't know how to read. The year 1937 was publicly predicted and provided with a foundation. And the hairy hand tossed out all the frills and gewgaws, too. Labor collectives prohibited. What nonsense was that? Self-government in camp. You couldn't think up anything better than the brigade anyway. What's all this about political indoctrination periods? Forget it. The prisoners are sent there to work, and they don't have to understand anything. At Ukhta they had proclaimed the liquidation of the last multiple bunk. This was a political mistake. Were the prisoners to be put to bed on cots with springs? Cram them on the bunks twice as thickly. Time off sentences? Abolish that before anything. What do you want? That the court's work should go for nothing? And what about those who already have credits toward time off sentences? Consider them cancelled. 1937. They are still permitting visits in some camps? Forbid them everywhere. Some prison or other permitted a priest's body to be turned over for burial outside prison? You must be insane. You are providing an opportunity for anti-Soviet demonstrations. There must be an exemplary punishment for this. Now make it clear the corpses of deceased prisoners belong to Gulag, and the location of graves is top secret. Professional and technical courses for prisoners? Dissolve them. They should have done their studying in freedom. And what about VTSIK? What VTSIK, anyway? Over Kalinin's signature? And we don't have a GPU. We have an NKVD. When they return to freedom, let them study on their own. Graphs, diagrams, tear them off the wall and whitewash the walls. And you don't even have to whitewash them. And what kind of payroll is this? Wages for prisoners? A Gumzak circular dated November the 25th, 1926. 25% of the wages of a worker of equivalent skill in state industry? Shut up and tear it up. We are robbing ourselves of wages. A prisoner should be paid. Let him say thank you, he wasn't shot. The Corrective Labor Code of 1933? Forget it once and for all. Take it out of all camp safes. Every violation of nationwide codes on labor, only on the basis of agreement with the Central Council of Trade Unions, the VTS-SPS? Do you really think we are going to go to the VTS-SPS? What's the VTS-SPS anyway? All we have to do is spit on it, and it will blow away. Article 75. The rations are to be increased for heavier labor? About face, rations are to be reduced for easier work. Just like that, and the food allotment is intact. The Corrective Labor Code, with its hundreds of articles, was swallowed up as if by a shark. And not only was it true that for 25 years afterward no one caught a glimpse of it, but even its name was unsuspected. They shook up the archipelago, and they became convinced that beginning back there with Solovki, and even more so during the period of the canals, the entire camp machinery had become intolerably loose. And now they got rid of all that weakness. In the very first place, the whole guard system was no good. These weren't real camps at all. They had guards posted on the watchtowers only at night, and at the gatehouse there was just one unarmed guard, who could even be persuaded to let one out for a bit. This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 4, Side 1. In the very first place, the whole guard system was no good. These weren't real camps at all. They had guards posted on the watchtowers only at night, and at the gatehouse there was just one unarmed guard, who could even be persuaded to let one out for a bit. They were still permitting kerosene lighting around the perimeter, and several dozen prisoners were being taken to work outside the camp by just a single rifleman. So now they wired the perimeter for electric light, using politically reliable electricians and motor mechanics. The riflemen of the guard were provided with battle statutes and military training. Attack-trained German shepherds were included in the required service staffs, with their own breeders and trainers and their own separate statutes. The camps began to assume, at long last, a fully modern, contemporary appearance, which we know very well indeed. This is not the place to list the many small details of daily life in which the camp regimen was made stricter and tightened up, and the many cracks that were discovered via which freedom could still observe the archipelago. All those ties were now broken off, and the cracks were filled in, and the last few observers' commissions were expelled. There is not going to be any other place in the book for an explanation of what these were, so let this be a lengthy note for those curious about it. Hypocritical bourgeois society thought up the idea of inspection of conditions in places of confinement and of the course of prisoner correction. In Tsarist Russia, the societies of guardianship over prisons, for the improvement of the physical and moral state of the prisoners, were the charitable prison committees and the societies of prison patronage. In American prisons, commissions of observers, consisting of public representatives, already possessed broad rights in the 20s and 30s, including even the right of release ahead of term, not petitioning for it, but release itself without action by a court. And indeed our dialectical legal experts pointedly protest. One must not forget what classes the commissions represent. They reach decisions in accordance with their class interests. It is quite a different thing here in our country. The very first temporary instruction of July the 23rd, 1918, which created the first camps, provided for the creation of assignment commissions attached to provincial penal departments. They assigned all sentenced prisoners one of 7 different types of confinement, which had been established in the early Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. This work, which apparently replaced that of the courts, was so important that the People's Commissariat of Justice, in its report of 1920, called the activity of the assignment commissions the nerve center of penal operations. Their makeup was very democratic. In 1922, for example, it was a troika, the chief of the provincial NKVD administration, a member of the presidium of the provincial court, and the chief of places of confinement in the specific province. Later on, one person was added from the Provincial Workers' and Peasants' Inspection and the Provincial Trade Union Council. But as early as 1929, there was great dissatisfaction with the commissions. They exercised their power to release prisoners before the end of term and to grant other benefits to hostile class elements. This was the rightist opportunist practice of the NKVD leadership. For this reason, assignment commissions were abolished in that self-same year of the great turning point, and in their place observers' commissions were created whose chairmen were judges and whose members consisted of the chief of the camp, the prosecutor, and a representative of the public, from workers in penal institutions, the police, the district executive committee, or the Komsomol. And, as our jurists pointedly declared, one must not forget what classes... Oh, excuse me, I have already quoted that. And the observers' commissions were entrusted with these tasks by the NKVD to decide the question of time-off sentences and release before the end of term, and by VTSIK, so to speak by Parliament, to verify the fulfillment of the production and financial plans. And it was these observers' commissions which were abolished at the beginning of the second 5-year plan. Speaking frankly, none of the prisoners sighed over the loss. Another thing about classes, now that we've mentioned them. One of the authors of that same collection we have cited so often before, Shestakova, on the basis of materials from the 20s and the beginnings of the 30s, reached a strange conclusion as to the similarity of the social origins of prisoners in bourgeois prisons and in our country. To her surprise, it turned out that both there and here those in prison were workers. Well, of course, there has to be some kind of dialectical explanation here, but she couldn't find any. And we will add on our own behalf that this strange resemblance was violated only in a minor degree in 1937 to 1938, when high state officials flocked into the camps. But very soon the proportions evened out. All the multi-million waves of the war and the post-war period consisted only of waves of the working classes. At the same time, the camp phalanxes, even though there seemed to have been glimmerings of socialism in them, were renamed columns so as to distinguish them from Francos. The camp security section, which up to this time had had to make allowances for the goals of the general productive work and of the plan, now acquired its own self-contained dominating significance, to the detriment of all kinds of productive work and of any staff of specialists. True, they did not drive out the camp cultural and educational sections, but this was partly because it was convenient to collect denunciations and summon stool pigeons through them. And an iron curtain descended around the archipelago. No one, other than the officers and sergeants of the NKVD, could enter and leave via the camp gatehouse. That harmonious order of things was established, which the Zeks themselves would soon come to consider the only conceivable one, the one we will describe in this part of the book, without the red ribbons by this time, and containing much more labor than correction. And that is when the wolf's fangs were bared, And that is when the bottomless pit of the archipelago gaped wide. I'll shoe you in tin cans, but you're going to go out to work. If there aren't enough railroad ties, I'll make one out of you. And that is when, sending freight trains through Siberia with a machine gun on the roof of every third car, they drove the 58s into excavation pits to guard them more securely. And that was when, even before the first shot of World War II, back when all Europe still danced foxtrots, they could not manage to crush the lice in the Mariinsk distributor, the intercamp transit prison of the Mariinsk camps, and brushed them off the clothes with whisk brooms. Typhus broke out, and in one short period 15,000 corpses were thrown into a ditch, curled up and naked, since even their underpants had been cut off them to be preserved for future use. We have already recalled the typhus which raged at the Vladivostok transit camp. And there was only one of its new acquisitions of the recent past that Gulag did not part with: the encouragement of the hoodlums, the thieves, the blatniers. Even more consistently than before, the thieves were given all the commanding heights in camp. Even more consistently than before, the thieves were egged on against the 58s, permitted to plunder them without any obstacles, to beat, to choke. The thieves became just like an internal camp police, camp stormtroopers. During the war years, in many camps, the custodial staffs were cut back to almost nothing, and their work was entrusted to the commandant's headquarters, meaning to the thieves who had become bitches, to the bitches, and the bitches were more effective than any custodial staff. After all, there was no prohibition against their beating. They say that in February to March 1938, a secret instruction was circulated in the NKVD: reduce the number of prisoners, and not by releasing them, of course. I do not see anything in the least impossible here. This was a logical instruction, because there was simply not enough housing, clothing, or food. Gulag was grinding to a halt from exhaustion. And this was when the pellagra victims lay down and died en masse. This was when the chiefs of convoy began to test the accuracy of machine gun fire by shooting at the stumbling Zeks. And this was when every morning the orderlies hauled the corpses to the gatehouse, stacking them there. In the Kolyma, that pole of cold and cruelty in the archipelago, that very same about-face took place with a sharpness worthy of a pole. According to the recollections of Ivan Semyonovich Karpunich-Bravin, former commander of the 40th Division and of the 12 Corps, who recently died with his notes incomplete and scattered, a most dreadfully cruel system of food, work, and punishment was established in the Kolyma. The prisoners were so famished that at Zaroshi Spring they ate the corpse of a horse, which had been lying dead for more than a week, and which not only stank but was covered with flies and maggots. At Utini Goldfield, the Zeks ate half a barrel of lubricating grease, brought there to grease the wheelbarrows. At Malga, they ate Iceland moss, like the deer. And when the passes were shot by snowdrifts, they used to issue 3½ ounces of bread a day at the distant goldfields, without ever making up for previous deficiencies. Multitudes of goners, unable to walk by themselves, were dragged to work on sledges by other goners who had not yet become quite so weak. Those who lagged behind were beaten with clubs and torn by dogs. Working in 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, they were forbidden to build fires and warm themselves. The thieves were allowed this. Karpunich himself also tried cold drilling by hand with a steel drill 6½ feet long, and hauling so-called peat, soil with broken stone and boulders, at 60 degrees below 0 on sledges to which 4 men were hitched. The sledges were made of raw lumber, and the boxes on top were made of raw slab. A 5th accompanied them, a thief expediter, responsible for fulfillment of the plan, who kept beating them with a stave. Those who did not fulfill the norm, and what does it mean, those who did not fulfill? because after all the production of the 58th was always stolen by the thieves, were punished by the chief of the camp, Zeldin, in this way. In winter, he ordered them to strip naked in the mine shaft, poured cold water over them, and in this state they had to run to the compound. In summer, they were forced to strip naked, their hands were tied behind them to a common pole, and they were left out, tied there, under a cloud of mosquitoes. The guard was covered by a mosquito net. Then, finally, they were simply beaten with a rifle butt and tossed into an isolator. Some will object that there was nothing new in all this, and no development, that this was a mere primitive return from the noisily educational canals to the directness of Solovki. Bah! But perhaps this was a Hegelian triad, Solovki, Belomor, Kolyma. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The negation of a negation, but enriched. For example, here are the death carriages, which, so far as can be learned, did not exist on Solovki. This is according to the recollections of Karpunich at Marizny Spring, 41 miles along the Sredneken Trail. For an entire 10-day period, the chief tolerated non-fulfillment of the norm. Only on the 10th day did he imprison in the isolator on a penalty ration those who had failed to fulfill, and then had them taken out to work again. But whoever did not fulfill the norm, even in these circumstances, was given the carriage, a frame of 16 by 10 by 6 feet on a tractor sledge, made of rough beams, fastened together with construction staples. A small door, no windows, and inside nothing at all, not even any bedboards. In the evening, those to be punished, sunk into a torpor, and already indifferent, were taken from the penalty isolator and packed into the carriage, locked in there with an enormous lock, and hauled off by tractor to a vale 2 to 3 miles from the camp. Several of those inside cried out, but the tractor unhitched them and left them there for a day. After a day it was unlocked, and the corpses were tossed out. The winter storms would bury them. At Malga, a subordinate camp of Elgin, under Chief Gavrik, the punishments for women who failed to fulfill the norm were lighter, simply an unheated tent in winter, but one was allowed to go outside and run around it. And at haying time, under the mosquitoes, an unprotected wattle shack. The recollections of Slyodsberg. The intensification of the cruelty of the Kolyma regime was outwardly marked by the fact that Garanin was made the chief of U.S. Vietlag, the administration of northeastern camps, and that the divisional commander of the Latvian riflemen, E. Bertsin, was replaced as head of Dalstroy by Pavlov. Incidentally, this totally unnecessary reshuffle was due to Stalin's suspiciousness. What was there to make one think that the old Chekist Berdzin could not just as well have satisfied the new demands of his associate? Would he have hesitated? At that point, they abolished the remaining days off for the 58th and lengthened the summer workday to 14 hours, came to consider 50 and 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit suitable for work, and allowed work to be cancelled only on those days when the temperature was lower than 65 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. And because of the caprices of individual chiefs, some took the prisoners out for work even at 75 below. At the Gorny goldfields, plagiarizing Solovki once more, those who refused to go out to work were tied to the sledges and hauled thus to the mine face. It was also accepted in the Kolyma that the convoy was not only present to guard the prisoners, but was also answerable for their fulfillment of the plan, and therefore had to avoid dozing and continue slave-driving them eternally. And then, too, the scurvy finished off many without any help from the administration. But all that was too little, insufficiently strict, and the number of prisoners wasn't being sufficiently reduced. And so the Garanin shootings began, which were outright murders, sometimes to the roar of tractors, sometimes without. Many camp points were known for executions and mass graves. Orotukan and Polyarny Spring, and Svistoplias, and Anushka, and even the agricultural camp Dukcha. But the most famous of all on this account were the Zolotisti goldfields. Chief of Camp Petrov, security operations officers Zelenkov and Anisimov, Chief of the goldfield Barkalov, Chief of the district branch of the NKVD Burov, and the Serpantinka. At Zolotisti they used to summon a brigade from the mine face in broad daylight and shoot the members down one after another. And this was not a substitute for night executions. They took place too. When the chief of Gulag, Nikolai Andreevich Aglanov, arrived, he liked at line-up to pick out some brigade or other which had been at fault for something or other and order it to be taken aside. And then he used to empty his pistol into the frightened, crowded mass of people, accompanying his shots with happy shouts. The corpses were left unburied. In May they used to decompose, and at that point the goners who had survived until then were summoned to cover them up, in return for a beefed-up ration, even including spirits. At the Serpantinka they used to shoot from 30 to 50 men every day under an overhanging roof near the isolator. Then they dragged the corpses off behind a hillock on tractor sledges. The tractor drivers, the stevedores, and the grave diggers lived in a separate barracks. After Garanin himself had been shot, they shot all of them, too. And another technique was used there. They led them up to a deep shaft blindfolded and shot them in the ear or the back of the head. No one mentions any resistance whatsoever. They shut down the Serpantinka and leveled both the isolator there and everything connected with the shootings, and filled in those shafts as well. In 1954, they discovered commercial gold ores at the Serpantinka about which they had not known earlier, and they had to mine among human bones. The gold was more precious. At those same gold fields where no executions were conducted, notices were read aloud or posted with the names in big letters and the alleged causes in small letters. For counter-revolutionary propaganda, for insulting the convoy, for failure to fulfill the norm. The executions were stopped temporarily because the plan for getting out the gold was not being fulfilled, and because they could not send new groups of prisoners across the frozen Okhotsk Sea. M.I. Kononenko waited more than half a year to be shot at the Serpantinka and survived. In addition, the regime hardened in respect to tacking on new terms. Gavrik at Malga used to organize this in a picturesque way. They used to ride ahead on horseback with torches in the Arctic night, and behind them they pulled with ropes to the district NKVD, 18 miles, those who faced new charges. At other camps it was all very routine. The classification and record sections merely selected from the card file those whose unreasonably short terms were coming to an end, summoned them in groups of 80 to 100 people, and prescribed for each a new tenor, R.V. Retz. Actually, I almost left Kolyma out of this book. Kolyma was a whole separate continent of the archipelago, and it deserves its own separate histories. Yes, and Kolyma was fortunate. Varlam Shalamov survived there, and has already written a lot. Yevgenia Ginsburg survived there, and O. Tzliotsberg, N. Surovtseva, N. Grankina, and others. And all of them have written memoirs. How is it that there is such a concentration of Kolyma memoirs, while the non-Kolyma memoirs are almost non-existent? Was this because they rarely hauled off the cream of the crop to Kolyma? Or was it, no matter how strange this may seem, that in the nearby camps they died off more rapidly? I only permit myself to cite here several lines of V. Shalamov on the Garanin executions. For many months there, day and night, at the morning and the evening checks, innumerable execution orders were read out. In a temperature of 50 below zero, the musicians from among the non-political offenders played a flourish before and after each order was read. The smoking gasoline torches ripped apart the darkness. The thin sheet on which the order was written was covered with hoarfrost, and some chief or other who was reading the order would brush the snowflakes from it with his sleeve, so as to decipher and shout out the name of the next man on the list of those shot. And so it was that the archipelago completed the second 5-year plan and, it would seem, entered socialism. The beginning of the war shook the archipelago chieftains. The course of the war at the very start was such that it might very likely have led to the breakdown of the entire archipelago, and perhaps even to the employers having to answer to the workers. As far as one can judge from the impressions of the Zeks from various camps, the course of events gave rise to 2 different kinds of conduct among the bosses. Some of them, those who were either more reasonable or perhaps more cowardly, relaxed their regime and began to talk with the prisoners almost gently, particularly during the weeks of military defeats. They were unable, of course, to improve the food or the maintenance. Others, who were more stubborn and more vicious, began, on the contrary, to be even stricter and more threatening with the 58s, as if to promise them death before liberation. In the majority of the camps, they did not even announce the beginning of the war to the prisoners. Our implacable passion for lies and secrecy. And only on Monday did the Zeks learn of it from those unescorted by convoy and from free personnel. Wherever radio existed, such as at Ust-Vim and many places in the Kolyma, it was silenced for the whole period of our military failures. In that very same Ust-Vim camp, they suddenly forbade the prisoners to write letters home. They could still receive them, and their kinfolk thereupon decided they had all been shot. And in some camps, sensing intuitively the direction of future policy, they began to isolate the 58s from the non-political offenders in compounds guarded with particular strictness, put machine guns up on the watchtowers, and even spoke thus to the Zeks who had formed up. "You are hostages!" Oh, how effervescent is this charge of carbonation, right from the Civil War. How hard it is to forget those words, and how easily they are remembered. "If Stalingrad falls, we are going to shoot the lot of you." And that was the atmosphere in which the archipelago natives asked about war communiques. Is Stalingrad still holding out, or has it already fallen? And in the Kolyma they hauled the Germans, Poles, and particularly notable prisoners from the 58s to such special compounds. But they immediately began to free the Poles in August 1941. 186 Poles were released from Zolotisty out of 2,100 brought there a year before. They went into Sikorsky's army in the west, and there, evidently, they told all about Zolotisty. And in June 1942, it was completely shut down. From the first days of the war, everywhere in the archipelago, on opening the packages of mobilization instructions, they halted all releases of 58s. There were even cases of released prisoners being sent back to camp while on their way home. In Ukhta, on June the 23rd, a group released was already outside the perimeter waiting for a train, when the convoy chased them back and even cursed them. "It's because of you the war began." Karpunich received his release papers on the morning of June the 23rd, but had not yet succeeded in getting through the gatehouse when they coaxed them out of him by fraud. "Show them to us." He showed them, and was kept in camp for another 5 years. This was considered to mean until special orders. When the war had already come to an end, in many camps they were forbidden even to go to the classification and record section and ask when they would be freed. The point was that after the war there were not enough people for a while, and many local administrations, even if Moscow allowed them to release prisoners, issued their own special orders so as to hold on to manpower. And that was how Y.M. Orlova was held in Karlag, and why she did not manage to get home in time to see her dying mother. From the very beginning of the war, in accordance no doubt with those same mobilization instructions, food norms were lowered in all camps, and the foodstuffs all got worse from year to year. Vegetables were replaced by fodder turnips, grits by vetch and bran. The Kolyma was supplied from America, and in some places there, in contrast, even white bread put in an appearance. But as a result of the prisoners growing weaker, the fall-off in output in vital lines of production became so bad, from 80 to 90%, that they found it useful to return to pre-war norms.
Many camp production centers got orders for munitions, and the enterprising directors of such mini-factories sometimes managed to feed the Zeks with supplementary food from auxiliary gardens.
Wherever they paid wages, these amounted in cash to 30 rubles monthly, and in terms of wartime prices on the open market, to less than 1 kilogram of potatoes a month. If one were to ask a wartime camp inmate his highest, supreme, and totally unattainable ambition, he would reply, "To eat just once a bellyful of black bread, and then I could die." During the war, they had buried no fewer dead in the camps than at the front, except that they have not been eulogized by the poets. L.A. Komogor, in a team of enfeebled prisoners, was engaged in the following light work for the entire winter of 1941 to 1942. Packing coffin crates made of 4 boards, 2 naked corpses to each, head by feet, at the rate of 30 boxes a day. Evidently the camp was close to the capital, which is why the corpses had to be packed into crates. The first month of the war passed, and the country adapted to the wartime rhythm of life. Those who had to went off to the front, and those who had to went off to the rear, and those who had to engaged in leadership and wiped their brows after drinking. And so it was in the camps, too. It turned out that all the scare had been for nothing, that everything was standing firm, that just as this particular spring had been wound up in 1937, so it would keep on working without stopping. Those jailers who at first had tried to curry favor among the Zeks now became fierce and knew no moderation or let-up. It turned out that the forms, the system of camp life, had been determined correctly once and for all, and would continue so for all eternity. 7 camp epochs will lay their cases before you, arguing as to which was worst for the human being. But pay attention to that of wartime. Zeks put it this way: whoever didn't serve time in wartime didn't know what camp was really like. Throughout the winter of 1941 to 1942 at Vyatlag, only in the barracks of the engineering and technical personnel and in the repair shops was any warmth of life flickering at all, and all the rest was frozen cemeteries, and Vyatlag was actually engaged in cutting firewood for the Perm Railroad. Here's what the wartime camp was: more work and less food, and less heat and worse clothes, and ferocious discipline, and more severe punishment. And that still wasn't all. The Zeks had always been deprived of external, audible protest, but the war even did away with the protest inside the soul. Any scoundrel with shoulder boards who was hiding from the front could shake his finger and preach, "And how are people dying at the front? And how are they working in freedom? And how many have died in Leningrad?" And as a result, the Zeks had no protest left even inside themselves. Yes, people were dying at the front, some of them lying in the snow, too. Yes, they were squeezing the life out of people in freedom, and the people were famished and starving. Yes, and the Free Labor Front, into which unmarried girls from the villages were mobilized, and in which they worked at logging, had only 24.5 ounces of bread and soup, which was dishwater, and was as bad as any camp. Yes, and in the Leningrad blockade they allotted even less than the camp punishment cell ration. During the war, the whole cancerous tumor of the archipelago turned out to be, or in any case represented itself to be, an allegedly important and necessary organ of the Russian body. It, too, was allegedly working for the war. On it, too, victory depended. And all this shed a false and justifying light on the strands of barbed wire, on the citizen chief who was shaking his finger. And there you were dying as one of the tumor's rotting cells, and you were deprived even of the dying man's satisfaction of cursing it. For the 58s, the wartime camps were particularly unbearable because of their pasting on second terms, which hung over the prisoners' heads worse than any axe. The security officers, busily engaged in saving themselves from the front, discovered in well-set-up backwaters and backwoods, in logging expeditions, plots involving the participation of the world bourgeoisie, plans for armed revolts and mass escapes. Such aces of Gulag as Y.M. Moroz, the chief of Untitled, particularly encouraged investigatory and interrogatory activity in his camps. In Untitled, sentences poured as if from a sack. Execution, 20 years, for incitement to escape, for sabotage. And how many there were for whom no trials at all were required, whose fates were determined by the movement of the stars. Sikorsky displeased Stalin, and in one night they seized 30 Polish women at Elgin and took them off and shot them. There were many Zeks, and this is something which was not fabricated, it is quite true, who applied from the first days of the war to be sent to the front. They had tasted the most foully stinking camp dregs, and now they asked to be sent to the front in order to defend this camp system and to die for it in a penalty company. And if I come out of it alive, I will return to serve out the rest of my term. The Orthodox Communists now assure us that they were the ones who begged to be sent to the front. And some of them did, including those Trotskyites who had survived the executions, but not very many. For the most part, they had got themselves set up in certain quiet spots in camp, not without the help of the communist chiefs either, where they could spend their time in contemplation, discussion, recollection, and waiting. And after all, in a penalty company, you'd last no more than 3 days. This desire to enlist was an impulse not of ideological principle, but of heart. This is what the Russian character was. It is better to die in an open field than in a rotten shed, to unwind, to become, even for just a short while, like everyone else, an unrepressed citizen. To get away from the stagnant feeling of doom here, from the pasting on of new terms, from silent annihilation. And some of them took an even simpler view of it all, but one which was not in the least shameful. Out there you would still die eventually, but for the moment they would give you a uniform to wear, feed you up, give you something to drink, transport you, and you could look out of the window of the railroad car and you could flirt with the girls at the stations. And then, too, there was an attitude of good-natured forgiveness. You've wronged us, and here's how we answer you. However, for the state, there was no economic nor organizational sense in carrying out all this superfluous shifting about of some people from camp to the front, and some people to camp in their place. Everyone had had his own circle of life and death determined for him. Once you've been classified among the goats, then you have to die as a goat. Sometimes they did take non-political offenders with short terms for the front, and not in penalty companies, of course, just in the ordinary active army. It didn't happen at all often, but there were cases in which they took 58s as well. Vladimir Sergeyevich Gorshunov was taken from camp to the front in 1943, and at the end of the war he was returned to camp with an extended sentence. They were all marked men, and it was simple for the security chief in their unit to paste a new term on them, much simpler than on newcomers. But the camp authorities did not entirely disregard this wave of patriotism. At the logging operations it had little impact, but slogans like, "Let's give coal above plan, it's light for Leningrad," or "Let us support the guard units with mortar ammunition," caught on well, as eyewitnesses report. Arseny Farmakov, a venerable person with a well-adjusted personality, tells how their camp was caught up in work for the front. He intended to describe it. The Zeks were unhappy when they were refused permission to collect money for a tank column, the Dzhidzinets. This phenomenon requires elucidation on many different planes, as in fact does the entire Soviet-German war. The decades go by. We do not manage to sort things out and understand ourselves, even on one plane, before the next one is deposited in a new layer of ash. There have not been freedom and purity of information in any decade, and from one blow to the next, people have not been able to comprehend either themselves or others or events. And as to rewards for this, as is universally known, soon after the end of the war, an amnesty was proclaimed for deserters, swindlers, and thieves, and special camps for the 58s. And the closer the war came to its end, the more and more cruel did the regimen for the 58s become, nor did one have to go far away from Moscow to the Zhida or the Kolyma camps to find this out. Right outside Moscow itself, almost within the boundaries of the city, in Kovrino, there was a shabby little factory to supply the internal needs of the NKVD itself. And attached to it, a strict regiment camp run by Mamulov, who was all-powerful because his own brother was the chief of Beria's secretariat. This Mamulov would pick out anyone he wanted from the Krasnaya Presnya transit prison, and he set up whatever regimen he pleased in his camplet. For example, he allowed visits with relatives, which were widely permitted almost everywhere in camps near Moscow, to be conducted only through 2 screens, as in prison. And he had the same kind of prison system in his barracks. Many bright lights left on at night, constant observation of those who were sleeping to make sure that on cold nights they would not cover themselves with their padded jackets. If they did, they were awakened. In the punishment cells, he had a clean cement floor and nothing else at all, just as in a regular, efficient prison. But no punishment he had designated gave him any satisfaction unless along with it, and before it, he bloodied the nose of the culprit. In addition, late-night inspections by the male jailers of the women's barracks, holding up to 450 prisoners, were a regular practice in his camp. They rushed in with wild whoops and the command, "Stand next to your cots." The half-dressed women jumped up, and the jailers searched both their persons and their beds with the minute thoroughness required to find a needle or a love note. If anything was discovered, the prisoner was sentenced to the punishment cell. Shklinik, chief of the chief mechanics section, went about the different factory sections on the night shift like a stooping gorilla, and no sooner had he noticed that someone had begun to doze, to nod his head, or shut his eyes, than with all his might he would hurl at him an iron block, a pair of pliers, a chunk of steel. Such was the regimen the camp inmates of Kovrino earned with their work for the front. They produced mortar shells throughout the war. The little factory was adapted for this output by a prison engineer. Alas, his name has not been remembered, but it won't get lost for good, of course. He created a design bureau also. He was serving time as a 58 and belonged to that category of human beings most repulsive to Mamulov because they refused to give up their own opinions and convictions. And yet, for a time, Mamulov had to tolerate this good-for-nothing. But no one is irreplaceable in our country, and when production was already sufficiently underway, one day in broad daylight, in the presence of the office personnel, intentionally in their presence, let everyone know, let them tell everyone, and we are telling it too, you see. Mamulov and 2 of his assistants rushed in, grabbed the engineer by his beard, threw him to the floor, kicked him with their jackboots till the blood flowed, and then sent him off to the Butyrki to get a second term for his political declarations. And this lovely little camplet was just 15 minutes by electric train from the Leningrad station. Not far, just sad. The newcomer Zeks who got into the camps near Moscow tried to hold on to them tightly if they had relatives in Moscow. Yes, and even without that. It seemed all the same that you were not being torn away into that far-distant abyss from which there was no return, that here, despite everything, you were on the edge of civilization. But this was self-deceit. They usually fed the prisoners their worse, calculating that the majority were receiving parcels, and they didn't even issue bedding. But the worst thing was the eternally nauseating latrine rumors which kept hovering over these camps about prisoner transports to far away. Life was as chancy as on the point of a needle, and it was impossible to be certain even for a day that you would be able to live it out in one and the same place. Such are the forms into which the islands of the archipelago hardened. But one need not think that as it hardened, it ceased to exude more metastases from itself. In 1939, before the Finnish War, Gulag's alma mater, Solovki, which had come too close to the west, was moved via the northern sea route to the mouth of the Yenisei River, and there merged into the already created Norilag, which soon reached 75,000 in size. So malignant was Solovki that even in dying it threw off one last metastasis, and what a metastasis! The archipelago's conquest of the unpeopled deserts of Kazakhstan belongs to the pre-war years. That was where the nest of Karaganda camps swelled like an octopus, and fertile metastases were propagated in Zhezkazgan with its poisoned cuprous water, in Mointy and in Balkhash, and camps spread out over the north of Kazakhstan also. New growth swelled in Novosibirsk province, the Mariinsk camps, in the Krasnoyarsk region, the Kansk camps and Kraslag, in Khakassia, in Buryat Mongolia, in Uzbekistan, even in Gornaya Shoria. Nor did the Russian north, so beloved by the archipelago, end its own growth. Ust-Vimlag, Niroblag, Usolag, nor the Urals, Ivdalag. There are many omissions in this list. It was enough to write Usolag to remember that there was also a camp in Usolye, in Irkutsk province. Yes, there was simply no province, be it Chelyabinsk or Kuibyshev, which did not give birth to its own camps.
This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 4, Side 2.
Yes, there was simply no province, be it Chelyabinsk or Kuibyshev, which did not give birth to its own camps. A new method of creating camps was adopted after the exile of the Germans from the Volga. Whole dispossessed villages were enclosed, just as they were, in a camp compound, and these were the agricultural camp sectors, the Kamensky agricultural camps between Kamyshin and Engels. We ask the reader's pardon for the many gaps and flaws in this chapter. We have cast only a frail bridge across the whole epoch of the archipelago, simply because we did not have any more material available. We could not broadcast pleas for more on the radio. Here, once again, the crimson star of Naftali Frankel describes an intricate loop in the heavens of the archipelago. The year 1937, which struck down its very own, did not spare his head either. Chief of Bamlag, an NKVD general, he was once again, out of gratitude, imprisoned in the Lubyanka, with which he was already familiar. But Frankel nonetheless did not weary of thirsting for the one true service, nor did the wise teacher weary of seeking out this service. The shameful and unsuccessful war with Finland began, and Stalin saw that he was unprepared, that there were no supply lines to his army thrust out into the Karelian snows. And he remembered the inventive Frankel and called him in. It was necessary right then, in the fierce winter, without any preparation whatsoever, without any existing plans even, or warehouses, or automobile roads, to build 3 railroads in Karelia, one rocade paralleling the border, and 2 more leading up to it, and to build them in the course of 3 months, because it was simply a disgrace for such a great power to mess about with that little pug-dog Finland for such a long time. This was straight out of a fairy tale. The evil king ordered the evil sorcerer to do something totally impossible and unimaginable. And so the leader of socialism asked, "Can you?" And the joyous merchant and black market currency speculator answered, "Yes." But this time he set his conditions. One, that he be taken out of Gulag entirely, and that a new Zek empire be founded, a new autonomous archipelago called Gulzhids, pronounced Gulzhides, the chief administration of camps for railroad construction, and that as head of this archipelago there be named Frankel. 2, that all the national resources he selected would be put at his disposal. This was not going to be another Bellamore. 3, that during the period of extreme emergency operation, Gulgides would also be removed from the socialist system with its exasperating accounting procedures. Frankel would not be required to render accounts about anything. He did not set up tents and did not establish any camps. He had no rations, no system of differentiated dining facilities, and no system of differentiated food pots. And it was he who had proposed the system of different levels of rations in the first place. Only a genius can repeal the laws of a genius. He piled up in the snow heaps of the best food, together with sheepskin coats and felt boots, and every Zek could put on whatever he pleased and eat as much as he wanted. Only the makorka and the vodka were controlled by his assistants, and they were the only things which had to be earned. The great strategist was willing, and Gulgides was created. Was the archipelago split in two? No. The archipelago only grew stronger, multiplied, and would proceed to take over the whole country even more swiftly. Frankel, however, did not succeed in completing his Karelian railroads. Stalin hurried to end the war in a draw. But Gulgides hardened and grew. It received more and more new orders to carry out, but now with normal accounting procedures. There was the Rockade Railroad paralleling the Iranian border, then the Rockade Railroad paralleling the Volga from Sitsran near Kuibyshev on down to Stalingrad, and then the Railroad of Death from Sarakar to Igarka, and then BAM proper, the Baikal-Amur main line from Taishet to Bratsk and farther. Further, Frankel's idea enriched the development of Gulag itself. It came to be considered necessary to organize Gulag itself in terms of branch administrations. Just as the Sovnarkom, the Council of People's Commissars, consisted of Narkomats, People's Commissariats, so Gulag created its own ministries for its own empire. Glavleslag, the chief administration of logging camps, Glavpromstroy, the chief administration of camps for industrial construction, GUL-GMP, the chief administration of camps for the mining and metallurgical industry. Then came the war, and all these Gulag ministries were evacuated to various cities. Gulag itself landed in Ufa, Gulgides in Vyatka. The communications between provincial cities were by no means so reliable as the radial communications out of Moscow, and for the whole first half of the war it was as if Gulag had disintegrated. It no longer ran the whole archipelago, and each surrounding area of the archipelago was subordinate to the administration evacuated to it. Thus it was that it fell on Frankel to run the entire Russian northeast from Kirov, because other than the archipelago there was almost nothing else there. But those who envisioned in this the fall of the Roman Empire were mistaken, for it would gather itself together again after the war in even greater majesty. Frankel remembered an old friendship. He summoned and named to an important position in Gulgides a man named Bukhaltsev, who had been the editor of his yellow sheet, the Kopek, in pre-revolutionary Mariupol, and whose colleagues had either been shot or scattered across the face of the earth. Frankel's talents were outstanding not only in commerce and organization. Taking in rows of figures at a glance, he could add them up in his head. He loved to brag that he could recognize 40,000 prisoners by face, and that he knew the family name, given name, and patronymic of each, their code article and their term. And it was required procedure in his camps to announce all this information at the approach of high-ranking chiefs. He always managed without a chief engineer, looking at a plan for a railroad station that had been brought him. He was quick to note a mistake in it, and then he would crumple up the plan, throw it in his subordinate's face, and say, "It's time you understand that you are not a designer, just a jackass." He had a nasal twang, and his voice was ordinarily calm. He was short. He used to wear the high karakul hat, the papacha, of a railroad general, dark blue on top, with a red lining. And he always, through the varied years, wore a field jacket of military cut, a garment which simultaneously constituted a claim to being a leader of the state and a declaration of not belonging to the intelligentsia. Like Trotsky, he always lived aboard trains, traveling around his scattered construction battlefields. And those summoned from the discomfort in which natives of the archipelago lived to confer with him in his railroad car were astonished at his bentwood chairs, his upholstered furniture, and were all the more timid in confronting the reproaches and orders of their chief. He himself never entered a single barracks, never smelled all that stench. He asked and demanded only work. He particularly loved to telephone construction projects at night, helping to perpetuate the legend about himself that he never slept. And in fact, during Stalin's era, many other big shots were accustomed to do the same. He never married. He was never again arrested. He became Kaganovich's deputy for railroad construction, and died in Moscow in the 50s with the rank of lieutenant general, in old age, in honor, and in peace. I have the feeling that he really hated his country. Chapter 5. What the archipelago stands on. There used to be a city in the Far East with the loyal name of Tsarevich, Crown Prince. The revolution saw it renamed Svobodny, meaning free. The Amur Cossacks who once inhabited the city were scattered, and the city was empty. They had to resettle it with someone. And they did, with prisoners and the Chekists guarding them. The whole city of Svobodny became a camp, Bamlag. And so it is that symbols are spontaneously born of life. The camps are not merely the dark side of our post-revolutionary life. Their scale made them not an aspect, not just a side, but very nearly the very liver of events. It was rare for our half-century so to manifest itself so consistently, with such finality. Just as every point is formed by the intersection of at least two lines, every event is formed by the intersection of at least two necessities. And so, although on one hand our economic requirements led us to the system of camps, this by itself might have led us to labor armies, but it intersected with the theoretical justification for the camps, fortunately already formulated. And so they met and grew together, like a thorn into a nest or a protuberance into a hollow. And that is how the archipelago was born. The economic need manifested itself, as always, openly and greedily. For the state, which had decided to strengthen itself in a very short period of time, and here 3/4 of the matter was in the period allotted, just as with Belomor, and which did not require anything from outside, the need was manpower. A, cheap in the extreme, and better still, for free. B, undemanding, capable of being shifted about from place to place any day of the week, free of family ties, not requiring either established housing or schools or hospitals, or even, for a certain length of time, kitchens and baths. It was possible to obtain such manpower only by swallowing up one's own sons. The theoretical justification could not have been formulated with such conviction in the haste of those years, had it not had its beginnings in the past century. Engels discovered that the human being had arisen not through the perception of a moral idea, and not through the process of thought, but out of happenstance and meaningless work. An ape picked up a stone, and with this everything began. Marx, concerning himself with a less remote time, Critique of the Gotha program, declared with equal conviction that the one and only means of correcting offenders, true, he referred here to criminals, he never even conceived that his pupils might consider politicals offenders, was not solitary contemplation, not moral soul-searching, not repentance, and not languishing, for all that was superstructure, but productive labor. He himself had never in his life taken a pick in hand. To the end of his days he never pushed a wheelbarrow, mined coal, felled timber. and we don't even know how his firewood was split. But he wrote that down on paper, and the paper did not resist. And for his followers, everything now fell into place. To compel a prisoner to labor every day, sometimes 14 hours at a time, as at the Kolyma mine faces, was humane and would lead to his correction. On the contrary, to limit his confinement to a prison cell, courtyard, and vegetable garden, to give him the chance to read books, write, think, and argue during these years meant to treat him like cattle. This is from that same critique of the Gotha program. True, in the heated times immediately following the October Revolution, they paid little heed to these subtleties, and it seemed even more humane simply to shoot them. And those whom they did not shoot, but imprisoned in the earliest camps, were imprisoned there not for purposes of correction, but to render them harmless, purely for quarantine. The point is that even then some minds were occupied with penal theory. For example, Pyotr Stuchka, and in the guiding principles of the criminal law of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic of 1919, the very concept of punishment was subjected to a new definition. Punishment, it was there very refreshingly affirmed, is neither revenge — the workers' and peasants' state was not taking vengeance on an offender — nor expiation of guilt. There is no such thing as individual guilt, merely class causation, but a defensive measure to protect the social structure, a measure of social defense. Once it is accepted as a measure of social defense, then it follows that war is war, and you either have to shoot, the supreme measure of social defense, or else imprison. But in this the idea of correction had somehow gotten muddied, though in that very same 1919 the 8th Congress of the party had called for correction. And foremost it had become incomprehensible. What should one be corrected for if there had been no guilt? It was hardly possible to be corrected for class causation. By then the Civil War had come to an end. In 1922 the first Soviet codes were established. In 1923 the Congress of the Penitentiary Labor Workers took place. The new basic principles of criminal legislation were composed in 1924, the foundations of the new criminal code of 1926, which hung around our necks for 35 years. And through all this, the newly found concepts that there is no guilt and no punishment, but that there is social danger and social defense, remained intact. Of course, this was more convenient. Such a theory made it possible to arrest anyone as a hostage, as a doubtful person, Lenin's telegram to Yevgenia Bosch, even to exile entire peoples because they were dangerous, and the examples are well known. But given all this, one had to be a first-class juggler in order still to construct and maintain in purified form the theory of correction. However, there were jugglers, and the theory was there, and the camps were indeed called corrective. And we can bring many quotations to bear even now. Vyshinsky, all Soviet penal policy is based on a dialectical combination of the principle of repression and compulsion with the principle of persuasion and re-education. All bourgeois penitentiary institutions try to harass the criminal by subjecting him to physical and moral suffering. They wish to reform him. In distinction from bourgeois punishment, the sufferings of the prisoners in our country are not an end, but a means. Just as there, too, it would seem, not an end, but a means. A.S. The end in our country is genuine reform, genuine correction, so conscientious laborers should emerge from the camps. Now, have you got it? Even though we use compulsion, we are nonetheless correcting, and also, as it turns out, via suffering, except it is not known exactly from what. But right then and there, on a nearby page, we find, with the assistance of revolutionary violence, the corrective labor camps localize and render harmless the criminal elements of the old society.
We're still talking about the old society. And even in 1952, we still keep talking about the old society. Pile everything on the wolf's neck. Blame it all on the old society. So, not a single word about correction. We are localizing and rendering harmless. And then in that same 1934, the two-in-one task is suppression plus re-education of anyone who can be re-educated. Of anyone who can be re-educated. It becomes clear that correction is not for everyone. And now a ready-made phrase from somewhere already flits about among the small-time authors. The correction of the corrigibles. The correction of the corrigibles. And what about the incorrigibles? Into a common grave? To the moon, Kolyma. Below Schmiditka, Norilsk. Even the corrective labor code of 1924 was criticized by Vyshinsky's jurists from the height of 1934 for a false concept of universal correction, because this code says nothing about destruction. No one promised that they would correct the 58s. And therefore I have called this part the destructive labor camps. That's how we felt them on our pelts. And if some of the jurists' quotations fit together crookedly, so be it. Just go raise up Stuchka from the grave, or drag out Vyshinsky, and let them make head or tail of it. I am not to blame. It is only now, on sitting down to write my own book, that I decided to leaf through my predecessors' works. Yes, good people had to help even here, because you'd not now be able to find their works anywhere. And as we dragged our soiled camp pea jackets about, we never even guessed at the existence of such books. That all our life there in camp was determined not by the will of the citizen chief, but by some kind of legendary labor code for prisoners. That was not just an obscure latrine rumor for us alone. Even the chief of the camp, a major, wouldn't have believed it for anything. Published in an edition for official use only, never held in anyone's hands, and no one knew whether they were still kept in the Gulag safes or whether they had all been burned as wrecking activity. Neither were quotations from them hung up in the cultural and educational corners, nor were their miserable figures proclaimed from the wooden rostrums. How many hours long was the work-day? How many rest days in a month? Is there payment for labor? Was there any provision for mutilation? Yes, and you would get a big horse laugh from your fellow Zeks, too, if you even asked such questions. Our diplomats were the ones who had seen and read these humane words. They had, it would seem, held up and brandished this booklet at international conferences. Indeed, I myself have only now obtained the quotations, and even now my tears flow. In the Guiding Principles of 1919, given the fact that punishment is not vengeance, then it may include no elements of torture. In 1920, the use of the condescending familiar form of address is forbidden in speaking to the prisoners. And forgive my language, but what about blank in the mouth? Is that permissible? The Corrective Labor Code of 1924, Article 49. The prison regime must be deprived of all elements of torture, handcuffs, punishment cells, strict solitary confinement, deprivation of food, visits through a grating only, are under no circumstances permitted. Well, that's enough. And there are no later instructions. That's enough even for the diplomats. And not even that is needed by Gulag. And in the Criminal Code of 1926, there was an Article 9. I learned about it by chance, and learned it by heart. Measures of social defense may not have as their purpose the infliction of physical suffering or the humiliation of human dignity, and do not aim at exacting revenge and retribution. Now that is clarity for you, because I enjoyed catching our bosses out on legal grounds. I often rattled off this section to them. And all these protectors of ours only popped their eyes in astonishment and indignation. There were old veterans who had served for 20 years, who were nearing their pensions, who had never yet heard of any Article 9, and for that matter had never held the code in their hands. Oh, what an intelligent, far-sighted, humane administration from top to bottom.
Alright, gonna call it there today.